Crete, an island situated in the eastern Mediterranean, became the stage upon which one of the world's earliest and most sophisticated civilizations would one day emerge. Long before palaces rose or writing appeared, its story began with small communities adapting to the island's diverse landscapes. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 7000 BCE, during the Neolithic era, people had already established permanent settlements. They cultivated the soil, raised animals, and developed the first patterns of social cooperation. The island's geography played a decisive role in this transformation. Crete's mountains divided the land into fertile plains and coastal valleys, encouraging local autonomy while ensuring access to the sea. Its position between Europe, Africa, and Asia made it a natural crossroads of exchange. Even before the first Bronze Age sailors ventured beyond their shores, this geography was shaping the habits, resources, and outlook that would define the Minoans centuries later. Early settlers reached Crete, most likely from Anatolia and the Levant, bringing with them domesticated plants and animals. Excavations at sites such as Knossos, Phaistos, and later at Myrtos reveal long sequences of habitation layers, indicating slow but continuous development. Their houses were built from stone foundations and mud brick walls, often clustered in small communities near water sources. Pottery from this period, simple at first, began to exhibit increasingly refined forms and decoration. This evolution in craft hints at a growing sense of identity and experimentation. Archaeologists have found obsidian tools imported from the Cycladic Islands, proving that maritime contact already existed. Such exchanges were limited in scale, yet they demonstrate an early awareness of Crete's maritime potential. Over time, these contacts would expand, linking Crete to the wider networks of the Aegean world. The Neolithic inhabitants relied on mixed farming economies. They cultivated wheat, barley, lentils, and peas, and kept goats, sheep, and pigs. This agricultural base provided reliable food resources that supported population growth. The combination of fertile soil and predictable rainfall created favorable conditions for settlement stability. Gradually, larger villages appeared, some approaching the scale of proto-towns. These communities organized labor for building, storage, and seasonal harvests. Such coordination may seem modest, but it represented an important step toward complex administration. By managing food surpluses and shared resources, early Cretans began developing social hierarchies. The presence of communal structures, such as large storage rooms or shared hearths, indicates collective effort guided by informal leadership. As centuries passed, the inhabitants of Crete improved their techniques in pottery, weaving, and metallurgy. Stone tools were gradually replaced by those made of copper, signaling the beginning of the island's transition into the Bronze Age. The discovery of copper daggers and chisels in early tombs shows that metallurgy had not only practical but also symbolic value. It became a marker of skill and possibly status. Trade for raw materials was essential, as Crete possessed limited metal deposits. This necessity stimulated contact with distant regions where copper and tin were available, encouraging navigation and exchange. Maritime routes that once carried obsidian and shells began to include metals, fine pottery, and eventually ideas. By the 3rd millennium BCE, these early communities had grown into organized settlements showing signs of planning. At sites like Vasiliki, the foundations of rectangular houses, paved courtyards, and small shrines suggest the first attempts at architectural order. Pottery styles such as Vasiliki ware, characterized by mottled red and black surfaces, demonstrate technical innovation and aesthetic refinement. Such progress reveals not only improving craftsmanship, but also the emergence of regional identities. Different areas of Crete developed distinctive ceramic traditions, implying both communication and competition among local groups. The island's fragmented geography, mountains separating coastal plains, encouraged such regional diversity while maintaining shared cultural roots. Religious practices during this era remain largely speculative, yet the archaeological record hints at a deep respect for natural forces. Figurines of female deities, small clay idols, and symbols associated with fertility and the earth suggest that worship was tied to cycles of nature. Caves, mountain peaks, and sacred groves became focal points of ritual activity. These sacred sites would persist for millennia, later forming part of the Minoan religious landscape. Through such continuity, we can trace the gradual evolution of spiritual ideas that linked environment and society. The people of Neolithic Crete, though still without written language, were already constructing a symbolic relationship with their world. The economy of these communities was based on exchange rather than currency. Barter and gift-giving maintained social cohesion and established networks of trust. Surplus goods, grain, oil, textiles, could be traded for raw materials or crafted items. Over time, these transactions became more regular and organized. Archaeological findings of standardized storage jars and seal impressions suggest an early understanding of accountability and distribution. This tendency toward record-keeping foreshadowed later administrative systems that would define Minoan governance. In essence, the seeds of bureaucracy were being planted within village life. Burial customs also reveal social differentiation. Early graves were simple pits or stone-lined cists, but over time, collective tombs appeared, such as those found at Aegean and Knossos. These communal burials suggest a belief in kinship groups or clans that shared ancestry and territory. Grave goods, pottery, tools, ornaments reflect both affection for the deceased and recognition of personal status. The increasing complexity of funerary practices provides evidence that hierarchy was developing, even if still modest. Such changes demonstrate how economic success and resource control could translate into social prestige. The island's location in the center of the eastern Mediterranean proved both an opportunity and a challenge. While it encouraged exchange, it also required navigation across open seas. The early Cretans developed sturdy vessels made of wooden planks sewn together with rope and waterproofed with resin. These boats, small by later standards, were sufficient for coastal and inter-island travel. Maritime activity expanded cultural horizons and introduced new materials, technologies, and ideas. Through contact with Egypt and the Near East, the people of Crete encountered artistic motifs, architectural concepts, and metallurgical techniques. Over centuries, such influences blended with local traditions to produce the distinctive Minoan style that would later flourish. One of the most striking features of early Cretan development is its apparent continuity. Unlike many regions where invasions disrupted progress, Crete's insular position offered relative protection. Cultural evolution proceeded steadily, allowing experimentation and adaptation without abrupt breaks. This stability encouraged innovation. Pottery workshops became more specialized, architecture more durable, and trade routes more predictable. The rhythm of agricultural and maritime life provided a foundation for long-term growth. Archaeologists studying the sequence of settlement layers at Knossos have noted that destruction layers are rare before 2000 BCE, emphasizing the island's remarkable consistency during its formative millennia. The environmental context of Crete also played a fundamental role. The island's climate, with mild winters and warm summers, supported olive and grape cultivation. These crops required careful management but yielded products ideal for trade. Olive oil and wine would later become the cornerstones of the Minoan economy. The early domestication of these plants began in the late Neolithic period, reflecting both adaptation to local conditions and awareness of their commercial potential. The cultivation of olives, in particular, required long-term planning, as trees take many years to mature. The decision to plant them implies a forward-looking mentality, an investment in the future that hints at emerging administrative foresight. Archaeological discoveries also point to the early use of seal stones, carved from soft materials like steatite. These seals were used to mark ownership or authenticity on containers and goods. Their appearance signals a growing concern for regulation and control of property. In later centuries, seals would become integral to Minoan administration, but their origins lie in these small, practical acts of identification. Each step toward organization, however modest, reflected a broader societal transformation, from informal cooperation to structured management. Throughout this long pre-palatial era, Crete's population gradually increased. New settlements appeared along the coast and in fertile inland valleys, suggesting both demographic growth and improved agricultural methods. The expansion of settlement networks required coordination over wider areas. Trade routes across land and sea linked communities, facilitating not only exchange but also cultural integration. Regional styles and pottery began to converge, hinting at shared beliefs or mutual recognition among different groups. The idea of a collective Cretan identity was slowly forming, even if political unification remained distant. The technological progress of the period also deserves attention. The introduction of the potter's wheel, likely around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, revolutionized ceramic production. It allowed faster, more uniform manufacture and opened possibilities for complex shapes. This innovation reduced labor costs and increased efficiency, reflecting an economy capable of specialization. Similarly, advances in metallurgy led to the production of bronze tools, combining copper with tin imported from distant lands. Such achievements required both technical knowledge and organized trade, further binding Crete to the maritime world beyond its shores. Cultural exchange left its mark on artistic expression. Decorative motifs from the Cyclades and Anatolia appear in Cretan pottery, while local artisans adapted them to create unique designs. This synthesis of influences demonstrates a dynamic cultural confidence. Rather than passively receiving external trends, early Cretans integrated them into their own traditions. The resulting visual language would later characterize Minoan art: balanced, naturalistic, and rhythmic. Even in these early centuries, the foundations of that aesthetic sensibility were being laid through experimentation in form and technique. Social organization likely centered on extended families or clans that controlled land and resources. Leadership may have been based on age, lineage, or skill rather than formal authority. Over time, as wealth from trade accumulated, elite groups emerged who could command labor and distribute goods. Their residences, larger and more elaborately furnished, may have functioned as administrative or ceremonial hubs. This gradual centralization of power represents one of the critical steps towards state formation. It was not imposed suddenly, but evolved from the practical needs of managing surplus, coordinating exchange, and maintaining order. The archaeological record also reveals the beginnings of symbolic communication. While true writing had not yet developed, marks on pottery and seal stones suggest proto-administrative symbols. These could denote ownership, content, or origin, serving as memory aids in trade and storage. Such signs anticipate the later creation of linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoan palatial period. The impulse to record and systematize information thus predates formal writing, illustrating the deep roots of administrative thinking in Cretan society. The interaction between humans and environment remained central to daily existence. Terracing on hillsides, irrigation channels, and the careful placement of settlements near water sources show an intimate understanding of landscape management. These practices minimized erosion and optimized crop yields. They also fostered cooperation, as maintaining such systems required collective labor. Through agriculture, the early inhabitants not only sustained themselves, but also built the social frameworks that would later support complex governance. The physical act of shaping the land became a means of shaping society. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Crete stood on the threshold of transformation. Its villages had become thriving communities engaged in regional trade and early administration. Technological innovations had raised productivity and fostered specialization. Cultural expression had achieved coherence through shared symbols and practices. Although still lacking the monumental architecture and organized hierarchy of later centuries, the essential components of civilization were in place. The island's people had learned to manage resources, communicate identity, and sustain interdependence. Their achievements formed the substratum upon which the Minoan world would rise. The transition from these Neolithic and early Bronze Age communities to the first palace societies around 2000 BC marks the beginning of a new epoch in Cretan history. The environmental stability, technological progress, and social organization established during the preceding millennia provided the framework for centralized authority. When the palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea appeared, they did not emerge from emptiness, but from centuries of cumulative experience. The quiet progress of those early farmers, traders, and craftsmen created the foundations for Europe's first great civilization. Over the next centuries, their island would transform from a mosaic of villages into a unified network of centers, each reflecting the evolving complexity of Minoan society. This development signaled the dawn of the palace culture and the beginning of a new phase in human organization, one that would define the identity of Crete for generations to come. Between 3000 and 2000 BCE, the island of Crete entered a transformative phase that reshaped its social and economic landscape. The once simple farming villages of the Neolithic era evolved into organized centers, showing early signs of hierarchy and long-distance exchange. Archaeological evidence from this period, often termed the Early Bronze Age, reveals a society that was no longer isolated or purely agrarian. Communities became more specialized, trade intensified, and craftsmanship reached new levels of sophistication. This transformation laid the groundwork for what would soon become the first palace civilization in Europe. The transition from rural simplicity to organized complexity was gradual but decisive, and it marked Crete's movement into history's spotlight as a hub of innovation and maritime connectivity. The physical environment continued to shape this evolution. Crete's geography, its coastal plains, fertile valleys, and protective mountains, offered both opportunity and constraint. While its isolation from the mainland limited invasions, it also encouraged self-sufficiency and adaptation. The island's natural harbors facilitated contact with the wider Aegean and Near Eastern worlds. As seafaring technology improved, small wooden vessels ventured farther afield, linking Crete with other island cultures such as the Cyclades and with regions of Anatolia and Egypt. Artifacts such as imported pottery, metalwork, and ivory confirmed the existence of maritime routes that predated the emergence of formal states. The island's communities began to see themselves not merely as isolated farmers, but as participants in a network of exchange that extended across the eastern Mediterranean. The development of metallurgy became one of the defining features of this period. Copper, the key material of the Bronze Age, was not abundant on Crete, so it had to be imported. This necessity encouraged the creation of trading relationships that tied Cretan communities to regions where raw materials were available. Archaeological discoveries of copper tools and weapons at sites like Mochlos, Vasiliki, and Murdos demonstrate growing skill in metalworking. Workshops equipped with furnaces, molds, and anvils suggest permanent craft specialization. Metallurgy transformed not only technology, but also social relations. Those who controlled access to metal held economic and possibly political influence, while skilled smiths gained new forms of prestige within their communities. The intensification of trade required more organized systems of production and distribution. Evidence of centralized storage areas, standardized containers, and seals points toward the beginnings of administrative practices. At several sites, archaeologists have uncovered seal impressions on clay nodules, indicating that goods were counted, sealed, and perhaps recorded. This represents one of the earliest known examples of economic management in Europe. The presence of these administrative devices implies a hierarchy capable of regulating production and controlling surplus. The leaders of these early centers may have acted as both economic coordinators and ritual authorities, mediating between the practical needs of trade and the symbolic world of belief. As wealth accumulated through commerce, communities began to compete for resources and prestige. Larger settlements emerged, often located near strategic points such as fertile plains or harbors. Knossos in the north, Phaistos in the south, and Malea on the central coast began to distinguish themselves as dominant centers. Excavations at these sites reveal increasingly complex layouts, with multi-room buildings, paved courtyards, and specialized workshops. Some structures included storerooms with pithoi, large storage jars, used for holding grain, oil, and wine. These developments signal a shift from subsistence agriculture to a redistributive economy managed by local elites. The accumulation and redistribution of goods strengthened social cohesion, but also reinforced inequality. Cultural interaction intensified during this period. Pottery styles evolved rapidly, reflecting both local innovation and external influence. The Vasiliki ware of eastern Crete, characterized by its mottled surface achieved through controlled firing, demonstrates technical mastery and aesthetic ambition. Similarly, the introduction of new vessel forms, such as spouted jugs and handled cups, reflects functional diversification. These developments are not merely artistic, but also economic indicators. The ability to produce fine ceramics for trade suggests surplus labor, stable production systems, and growing market demand. The exchange of goods thus became a channel through which ideas, symbols, and technologies circulated, gradually linking Cretan communities into a coherent cultural sphere. Religion also began to take on a more organized form. Sacred symbols such as the double axe, bull horns, and female figurines appear with increasing frequency in the archaeological record. While their precise meanings remain uncertain, they point to an evolving ritual system that connected society, nature, and authority. Small shrines and peak sanctuaries, often located on elevated terrain, indicate that religious practice was no longer confined to domestic spaces. Ritual gatherings at these sites may have served to strengthen social bonds and legitimize emerging leadership. Religion thus functioned as both a unifying ideology and a source of political legitimacy, linking divine order with human governance. Burial practices further reflect these social changes. The transition from simple graves to collective tombs, such as the Tholos tombs of southern Crete, reveals an increasing concern with lineage and group identity. These circular stone-built tombs housed multiple generations, suggesting that kinship groups were becoming central to social organization. Grave goods, pottery, jewelry, and weapons demonstrate distinctions of status and wealth. The presence of imported objects within tombs confirms the role of elites as intermediaries in long-distance exchange. In this way, burial customs mirror broader economic and political transformations. As material culture grew more elaborate, so too did the symbols of authority. Archaeologists studying this phase emphasize that these changes were evolutionary rather than revolutionary. There is little evidence of abrupt invasion or external imposition. Instead, the transformation from village life to complex society seems to have arisen internally, driven by the interplay of geography, trade, and technological innovation. Each community adapted to its environment while remaining connected through maritime exchange. This combination of local development and regional interaction fostered resilience and creativity. By 2200 BCE, Crete exhibited the essential features of a pre-state society: stratified classes, organized production, ritual integration, and early administrative control. One of the most instructive discoveries comes from the site of Myrtos, where archaeologists unearthed a building complex showing clear evidence of planned organization. Separate rooms for storage, food preparation, and craftwork suggest a division of labor. The presence of a communal courtyard hints at social gatherings or administrative activity. Such buildings represent a stage between ordinary houses and the monumental palaces that would appear in the following centuries. They demonstrate that concepts of space, hierarchy, and function were already being developed long before the first kings or priests ruled. The evolution of architecture thus mirrored the evolution of society itself. The expansion of maritime trade during this period cannot be overstated. Cretan ships, small but efficient, began to sail regularly across the Aegean, carrying surplus goods and returning with metals and exotic materials. The sea became both a highway and a unifying element of culture. Contact with Egypt during the Old and Middle Kingdoms brought not only goods, but also ideas about administration, architecture, and art. Egyptian scarabs found on Crete attest to these exchanges. While Crete never copied foreign models directly, it absorbed and transformed them within its own cultural framework. This capacity for adaptation would remain a hallmark of Minoan civilization. As the island's economy expanded, social tensions may have accompanied prosperity. The control of trade and surplus concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. This inequality required new mechanisms of authority to maintain order and legitimacy. Archaeological traces of feasting, communal rituals, and shared festivals suggest that elites used religious and social gatherings to reinforce cohesion. Such events allowed redistribution of resources while displaying the generosity and power of leaders. Over time, these gatherings may have evolved into institutionalized ceremonies conducted within the great palaces that were soon to appear. Technological innovation continued to advance in step with social complexity. The introduction of fast-wheel pottery allowed mass production of uniform vessels, a clear sign of economic specialization. Metallurgical techniques improved, producing stronger and more decorative objects. The rise of craft workshops, dedicated spaces for potters, metalworkers, and stone carvers, illustrates a significant division of labor. Artisans no longer worked solely for subsistence, but as part of organized economies serving regional markets. This professionalization represents an important threshold in human history, the movement from community-based production to structured industry. Agriculture also evolved during this era. Farmers introduced new crop rotations, expanded olive cultivation, and improved storage capacity. Terracing on slopes and the use of irrigation channels increased yields, enabling the support of larger populations. The surplus generated by these improvements fed urban growth and freed labor for non-agricultural pursuits. This process, by which efficient food production underpins social complexity, was one of the key drivers of early civilization. Crete's ability to sustain dense populations without depleting its environment was a factor in its later success. The social organization of these proto-urban centers remains partially obscure, but patterns can be inferred. Power likely resided in local chieftains or councils who coordinated trade, religion, and defense. Their authority may have been symbolic as much as practical, derived from the ability to mediate between human and divine realms. Over generations, these roles would formalize into dynastic leadership. The notion of central authority, though embryonic, was emerging. When the first palaces were built around 2000 BCE, they represented not a sudden invention, but the culmination of centuries of incremental centralization. Archaeological finds from this period include early examples of what may be administrative recording, incised signs, or marks on pottery and ceilings. While not yet a writing system, these marks demonstrate awareness of the need to document exchange and ownership. They anticipate the later linear, a script used in palace archives. The impulse to record economic transactions is a hallmark of organized governance, and its presence in pre-palatial Crete underscores how deeply administrative thinking was embedded in its society even before statehood emerged. Ritual life, intertwined with daily existence, also gained structure. Evidence from peak sanctuaries shows offerings of pottery, figurines, and animal bones, indicating regular communal worship. These gatherings reinforce social unity while linking agricultural cycles to divine protection. The duality of nature and divinity became a constant theme in Cretan belief, one that would persist through the height of Minoan culture. The role of ritual specialists, perhaps early priests or priestesses, may have expanded during this time, connecting political authority with sacred duty. By the closing centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE, Crete stood on the edge of transformation. Its settlements were prosperous, its artisans skilled, and its trade networks extensive. Social hierarchy had become established, and the first elements of state organization were visible. Yet this society remained flexible, capable of adapting to external influences without losing its identity. The foundation for Minoan civilization was now complete. Technological expertise, economic integration, religious ideology, and emergent governance all coexisted in balance. Over the next generations, this balance would culminate in the creation of monumental palace centers that embodied the unity of political, economic, and religious life. The gradual rise from scattered villages to coordinated proto-states demonstrated the potential of human cooperation guided by trade and belief. As the island entered the 2nd millennium BCE, the architectural and administrative experiments of the preceding centuries would find their full expression in the first palaces. The transition to the palace era marked not an abrupt beginning, but the natural outcome of the processes set in motion during this formative age of early Minoan society. Around 2000 BCE, a transformation unfolded on Crete that marked the beginning of Europe's first palace civilization. The small, self-sufficient communities that had thrived for millennia began to concentrate their power, wealth, and religion within monumental architectural complexes. These were not simply large dwellings or fortresses. They were organized centers that coordinated economy, ritual, and administration. Archaeological excavations at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros reveal structures of extraordinary complexity, featuring multiple floors, intricate corridors, storerooms, workshops, and ceremonial courts. The emergence of these palaces represents a profound shift in social organization, a move from regional networks of villages to centralized authorities capable of governing extensive territories. The Minoan world had entered its first palatial age, roughly spanning from 2000 to 1700 BCE, a period that witnessed innovation in architecture, economy, and governance unprecedented in the Aegean world. The first palaces did not arise suddenly. Their foundations were rooted in centuries of gradual development. The island's prosperity, built on agriculture and trade, demanded new systems of coordination. The redistribution of goods, grain, oil, and textiles required centralized storage and record-keeping. The palace provided both. At Knossos, vast magazines lined with large pithoi demonstrate a bureaucratic concern for inventory management. Each vessel could hold hundreds of liters of oil or grain, and the presence of ceilings on containers indicates formal control of resources. The palace thus functioned as both a granary and a treasury. Its administrators managed production, collection, and distribution, ensuring the stability of the island's economy. The complexity of this system suggests a hierarchy of officials operating under a central authority, though whether that figure was a king, queen, or priestly ruler remains unknown. Architecturally, these early palaces reveal an advanced understanding of design and planning. The builders incorporated light wells, staircases, and drainage systems that demonstrate mastery of engineering. Walls were constructed with ashlar masonry, carefully cut stone blocks fitted without mortar, while floors were paved with gypsum slabs. The arrangement of rooms around large central courts provided open space for gatherings, ceremonies, and possibly administrative assemblies. This architectural unity expressed both practical and symbolic purposes. The palace was a physical embodiment of social order, a controlled, balanced environment reflecting the stability and harmony of Minoan society. Its construction required skilled labor, coordination, and resources on a scale that could only be achieved by an organized state. Religious activity was deeply intertwined with palatial authority. Shrines within the complexes contained altars, cult objects, and figurines, indicating that rulers held both administrative and sacred responsibilities. The dual role of the palace as temple and government building distinguished Minoan society from many of its contemporaries. The central court may have served as the stage for religious festivals or processions involving dance, music, and possibly the famous bull-leaping rituals later depicted in frescoes. These events reinforced the legitimacy of leadership through communal participation and shared beliefs. The blending of political and spiritual functions gave the palace a unifying power that extended beyond economic management. The introduction of the linear A script around this time marks a key milestone in administrative development. Though still undeciphered, this writing system was used primarily for accounting and record-keeping. Clay tablets and sealings found at Knossos and other sites suggest systematic documentation of goods and transactions. Writing allowed for long-term management and coordination, enabling rulers to govern more efficiently. It also reflects an intellectual leap, the transformation of spoken language into an instrument of control and communication. Through writing, the palace economy became not only tangible but also traceable. Each mark on clay represented an item, a duty, or a portion of wealth that bound society together through accountability. Trade expanded dramatically during this first palace period. Crete's position in the eastern Mediterranean made it a natural hub for maritime exchange. Minoan merchants exported fine ceramics, textiles, and olive oil, and imported metals, ivory, and precious stones from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant. Ships with high prows and wide hulls could carry large cargoes across the Aegean and beyond. Archaeological finds of Minoan pottery on distant shores testify to the reach of this network. The sea became the highway of prosperity, allowing Crete to accumulate wealth without dependence on conquest. This maritime economy was organized through the palaces, which acted as both centers of production and redistribution. Each palace managed its surrounding territory, collecting agricultural goods from villages and sending manufactured products abroad. The entire island functioned as a coordinated system, unified by trade and overseen by a hierarchy of administrators. Art and architecture during this era reflect a growing sophistication and confidence. The walls of palaces were decorated with frescoes depicting natural scenes, plants, animals, and marine life, rather than battles or rulers. This focus on nature suggests a worldview grounded in harmony rather than domination. Artisans worked with stone, ivory, and metal to produce objects of exceptional quality. The famous kamars ware pottery, found in palatial contexts, exemplifies technical excellence. Thin-walled vessels painted with intricate patterns in red, white, and orange on a dark background. The standardization of such high-quality goods implies centralized workshops and quality control. Artistic production was not merely decorative, but part of the economic system that reinforced cultural unity and elite identity. The organization of labor within these palaces was complex. Farmers, herders, and fishermen provided the raw materials, while specialized craftsmen transformed them into finished products. Administrators supervised collection, storage, and distribution. This division of labor created interdependence among social classes, binding the island into an integrated economy. While the majority of the population lived in rural villages, their lives were influenced by the rhythms of the palace system. Seasonal festivals, trade cycles, and administrative demands all radiated from these central hubs. The palace served as the heart of both production and ritual, sustaining the island's prosperity through coordination rather than coercion. Gender roles within this early palatial society appear to have been more balanced than in many contemporary cultures. Artistic representations show women participating in religious and ceremonial activities alongside men. Female figures often appear as priestesses or goddesses, central to ritual life. This prominence may reflect social structures in which women held significant spiritual or administrative influence. While definitive conclusions are difficult without written texts, the visual record suggests a society that valued cooperation over strict hierarchy. The aesthetic and cultural focus on symmetry, balance, and movement mirrors this social equilibrium. Environmental management played an important part in sustaining this complex system. The Minoans expanded olive and grape cultivation, developed terraced fields, and maintained irrigation works to maximize productivity. Their ability to adapt to the island's varied terrain ensured stable food supplies. Surplus production allowed for long-distance trade and supported population growth. Archaeobotanical evidence confirms that Minoans carefully managed resources to prevent depletion. Their agricultural foresight contributed to centuries of stability, providing the foundation upon which palatial civilization flourished. As the palaces grew in power, they also became centers of cultural dissemination. Artistic motifs, religious symbols, and administrative practices spread across the island, creating a unified Minoan identity. The resemblance among the major palaces suggests coordination rather than rivalry. Although each served as a regional capital, their architectural similarities indicate shared ideals and possibly centralized oversight. The uniformity of design and decoration implies a common cultural language that transcended local differences. Through these networks, Crete achieved a level of cohesion unmatched in the Aegean world at that time. The construction of these monumental complexes required organized labor and technological expertise. The precision of masonry and the scale of engineering reflect careful planning and resource allocation. Quarries supplied large blocks of limestone and gypsum, while skilled workers shaped and fitted them with minimal waste. Timber from the island's forests provided beams for ceilings and floors, and the use of plastered walls enhanced both durability and brightness. The investment of labor and materials in these projects demonstrates not only wealth, but also vision. The palaces were enduring symbols of communal achievement and administrative order. Despite their grandeur, the first palaces were not isolated from ordinary life. Surrounding towns provided homes for artisans, merchants, and workers who depended on palace administration. The proximity of workshops to ceremonial areas suggests a seamless connection between production and ritual. Daily activity, grinding grain, weaving cloth, or storing oil, occurred within the same environment as religious ceremonies and administrative gatherings. This integration of functions distinguished Minoan palaces from later royal fortresses. They were not built for defense, but for management and celebration. Their openness and lack of fortification imply a society confident in its stability and maritime dominance. The archaeological record indicates that these palaces experienced cycles of destruction and rebuilding, often caused by earthquakes. Crete lies within a seismically active zone, and tremors periodically damaged or destroyed structures. Each time, the inhabitants rebuilt on the same site, often with improved design. This pattern reveals both resilience and continuity. Natural disasters did not end Minoan progress, but stimulated architectural innovation and reinforced communal identity. The ability to recover from catastrophe speaks to the island's organizational strength and social cohesion. One of the most remarkable features of this period is the consistency of cultural expression across different regions of Crete. Pottery styles, architectural plans, and religious symbols display remarkable uniformity. This suggests effective communication and shared administration across the island. Some scholars have proposed the existence of a central authority, possibly based at Knossos, that coordinated the activities of the other palaces. While direct evidence of a unified state remains debated, the material culture points to an interconnected system of governance. Crete's political organization may have resembled a federation of palace centers, each autonomous yet aligned in ideology and practice. The prosperity of this first palatial age reached its peak around 1800 BCE. At this point, the island enjoyed economic expansion, cultural refinement, and relative peace. The administrative systems functioned smoothly, trade flourished, and art reached new levels of complexity. The harmony of architecture and design reflected the balance of society. Yet beneath this stability lay vulnerabilities. The very interdependence that made the system strong also made it fragile. A disruption in trade routes, a major earthquake, or internal rivalry could threaten the equilibrium. Indeed, around 1700 BCE, the first palace system came to an abrupt end, likely through a combination of seismic activity and political upheaval. Many of the great buildings were destroyed, only to be rebuilt soon after with even greater splendor. The first palaces of Crete thus represent both an achievement and a beginning. They consolidated centuries of development into tangible form, creating institutions that would define the Minoan world for centuries. Through architecture, writing, and administration, they turned scattered settlements into an organized civilization that influenced the entire Aegean. Their legacy persisted long after their initial destruction, shaping the rebirth of Minoan culture in the Second Palace period. As Crete recovered from the disasters that ended this phase, it entered a new era of innovation, power, and artistic excellence, the high point of Minoan civilization that would soon make the island a beacon of the ancient world. The centuries following the destruction of the first palaces around 1700 BC marked not an end, but a renewal. Out of the ruins rose an even more sophisticated society, one that would bring Minoan civilization to its zenith. Archaeological evidence reveals that the palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros were rebuilt on a grander scale, incorporating more advanced engineering, refined artistic styles, and an even greater level of administrative complexity. This second palatial period, lasting from roughly 1700 to 1450 BCE, represents the height of Minoan power and cultural achievement. During these years, Crete became a dominant maritime force in the Aegean, exerting influence over neighboring islands and mainland Greece. Its art, architecture, and trade networks flourished, giving rise to a distinct identity that combined elegance, efficiency, and deep religious symbolism. The rebuilding process itself reveals much about the resilience of the Minoan people. Instead of abandoning the devastated sites, they reconstructed them with improved designs. At Knossos, for instance, the new palace expanded across several acres, featuring more than 1,000 interconnected rooms. Corridors led to storerooms, archives, workshops, and shrines. The layout was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate plan to integrate administrative and ceremonial functions within one coherent space. Advanced plumbing systems supplied running water and drainage, while light wells and open courtyards maintained air circulation and illumination. This architectural sophistication testifies to the technical and organizational capabilities of Minoan engineers and craftsmen. The new palaces were more than administrative hubs. They were expressions of collective identity and stability, designed to project order and prosperity after a period of turmoil. The Palace of Knossos stands as the most complete representation of this era's complexity. Excavations by Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century uncovered its elaborate layout, revealing a civilization that prized coordination and beauty in equal measure. The central court, surrounded by grand staircases and colonnaded halls, served as the focal point for rituals and gatherings. Around it, storage magazines held large pit-hoy filled with oil and grain, while workshops produced fine ceramics, metalwork, and textiles. Frescoes adorned the walls with scenes of nature, processions, and religious ceremonies. Unlike the monumental art of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Minoan decoration emphasized movement, fluidity, and life. Dolphins swam across painted walls, lilies and ivy twined around columns, and people were depicted in graceful, dynamic postures. These images offer insight into a culture that celebrated vitality and harmony with the natural world. One of the defining features of this second palatial age was the sophistication of Minoan administration. The linear A script continued to be used for record-keeping, with thousands of clay tablets and seal impressions found in palace archives. Although the script remains undeciphered, its consistent use across the island indicates a highly organized bureaucratic system. Each palace appears to have maintained detailed records of goods received and distributed, along with information about workers and production quotas. This suggests a level of governance comparable to the city-states of Mesopotamia, though likely more collaborative and less militarized. The Minoan palatial economy functioned on principles of redistribution. Agricultural and crafted goods flowed into the palace centers, were recorded, stored, and then reallocated to support trade, labor, and ritual activities. Trade reached its greatest extent during this period. Minoan ships sailed throughout the eastern Mediterranean, connecting Crete with Egypt, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Greek mainland. The archaeological record shows Minoan pottery and artifacts appearing as far afield as Syria and Italy, evidence of thriving commercial exchange. In return, Crete imported copper, tin, gold, ivory, and luxury goods. The Minoans were not conquerors. Their influence spread through commerce, diplomacy, and culture rather than war. Their maritime skill earned them control of vital sea routes, and ancient later traditions would even refer to a thalassocracy, a sea-based dominion centered on Crete. Whether literal or symbolic, this concept reflects the island's unmatched mastery of the Aegean waters during the 17th and 16th centuries BCE. Religion and ritual continued to play a central role in legitimizing authority and sustaining social cohesion. The reconstructed palaces retained shrines, cult rooms, and sacred symbols, linking governance with divine sanction. Figurines of goddesses holding serpents, along with sacred horns and double axes, suggest a belief system rooted in fertility, renewal, and the cyclical nature of life. Outdoor sanctuaries and mountaintop shrines connected religious practice to the landscape, emphasizing harmony between humanity and the natural world. The frequency of ritual imagery in art indicates that festivals and processions were integral to public life. These ceremonies may have reinforced the unity of palace and people, blending faith and administration into one continuous system of meaning. The bull remained a powerful symbol during this time, appearing in frescoes, seal stones, and sculptures. The famous bull-leaping scenes, found at Knossos and other sites, likely represent a ritualized performance rather than a sport. Participants, both men and women, are shown grasping the horns of a charging bull, vaulting over its back in fluid motion. The imagery conveys not violence, but coordination, courage, and grace. This activity may have symbolized the human mastery of natural forces or the renewal of life through controlled danger. Whatever its exact meaning, it demonstrates the Minoans' ability to transform ritual into art, turning physical expression into a reflection of their cosmology. Technological advances paralleled artistic refinement. Minoan metalworkers produced intricate jewelry and weapons using techniques such as granulation and inlay. Potters perfected new shapes and styles, including the marine-style vessels decorated with octopuses, fish, and shells. These motifs captured the islanders' intimate relationship with the sea and their observation of natural patterns. Architecture also evolved. Columns became more stylized, floors were plastered and painted, and windows allowed light to diffuse gently through rooms. The integration of form and function gave Minoan design a timeless aesthetic balance. Even today, reconstructions of Knossos reveal a sense of modernity, open spaces, natural light, and clean geometry that feels surprisingly contemporary. Cretan society during this period appears to have been prosperous and relatively peaceful. Unlike the fortified citadels of mainland Greece, Minoan palaces were open and unfortified, reflecting confidence in maritime security and internal order. Settlements across the island shared architectural features, pottery styles, and religious symbols, suggesting unity rather than competition. The absence of large-scale weaponry or war imagery implies that diplomacy and trade were preferred means of interaction. The stability of this era fostered population growth and urban expansion, with towns such as Gornia, Palicastro, and Mochlos flourishing as regional centers linked to palace economies. Social organization seems to have been complex yet integrated. A class of administrators, scribes, and priests oversaw production and ritual. Artisans and merchants formed the skilled middle stratum, while farmers and laborers supported the agricultural base. Each group contributed to the collective functioning of the system. Women continued to play visible roles in religious and social life, as shown in art and ritual depictions. The prominence of female figures, whether as deities, priestesses, or participants, suggests that gender held symbolic balance within Minoan cosmology. The society's visual culture, emphasizing fluidity and symmetry, reinforces this perception of equilibrium rather than hierarchy. Economically, the Second Palatial Age was the most dynamic in Minoan history. The island's production of olive oil, wine, and textiles increased, supported by efficient agricultural systems and skilled labor. The palaces acted as central redistribution centers, ensuring steady flow of goods between producers and consumers. The surplus allowed for specialization, long-distance trade, and the patronage of artisans. This system required trust in the administrative order, maintained through record-keeping, ritual affirmation, and shared cultural values. The balance between economic management and religious authority made the Minoan model distinct from the coercive states of the Near East. Archaeological finds from this era reveal both opulence and precision. Stone vessels carved from serpentine and alabaster display exceptional craftsmanship. Frescoes from Akrotiri on the nearby island of Thera, strongly influenced by Minoan art, show that Crete's cultural reach extended across the Aegean. These murals depict processions, landscapes, and ships with extraordinary detail, offering glimpses into the interconnected world of the Eastern Mediterranean. The exchange of ideas and aesthetics between Crete and Thera indicates a shared cultural sphere shaped by trade and mutual respect. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, pressures began to build. The very system that sustained Minoan success, its centralization, made it vulnerable to disruption. The reliance on palace coordination meant that local economies were dependent on administrative continuity. A major earthquake or natural disaster could interrupt this delicate balance. Geological evidence suggests that around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted with enormous force, one of the largest eruptions in recorded history. The resulting tsunamis and ash clouds likely devastated coastal settlements and trade routes, dealing a severe blow to Minoan stability. Although the palaces were rebuilt once again, the event may have weakened the island's maritime dominance and economic confidence. Despite these challenges, Minoan culture continued to exert influence across the Aegean. The architecture and artistic styles of the Mycenaean palaces on mainland Greece bear clear Minoan elements, suggesting either direct contact or emulation. This cultural exchange demonstrates that Crete remained a model of sophistication even as external pressures mounted. The interaction between Minoans and Mycenaeans would soon reshape the political landscape of the region. By the middle of the 15th century BCE, the Second Palace period was drawing to a close. Evidence of widespread destruction appears again at many sites, including Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros. Whether caused by renewed earthquakes, internal unrest, or external invasion remains uncertain. However, around this time, Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland began to establish a presence on Crete. Their influence grew, and eventually Knossos came under Mycenaean control. The Linear B script, derived from the earlier Linear A, began to appear, marking a new administrative language and a shift in power. The Second Palace Age thus represents both the culmination and the turning point of Minoan civilization. In these centuries, Crete achieved its greatest artistic, economic, and cultural expression, becoming a beacon of Bronze Age refinement. Its open palaces, maritime trade, and balanced social order left an enduring impression on the Aegean world. Yet the forces of nature and the ambitions of neighboring powers would soon alter its destiny. As Minoan independence waned and Mycenaean authority rose, the character of the island began to change. What emerged was a hybrid civilization, part Minoan, part Mycenaean, that carried forward the legacy of Crete's golden age while paving the way for a new era in Greek history. After the cataclysmic upheavals of the mid-15th century BCE, the world of Crete entered a profound phase of transformation. The destruction that swept through the island's palaces, particularly at Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros, marked not only the collapse of an architectural order but also the end of Minoan political autonomy. When the palaces rose again, they did so under new authority. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, whose centers at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were already thriving, had extended their influence across the Aegean. Archaeological and linguistic evidence demonstrates that by around 1450 BC, Knossos had come under Mycenaean control. The appearance of Linear B tablets in the administrative archives confirms this shift. A new language, an early form of Greek, replaced the undeciphered Minoan Linear A. Yet despite the change in rulers, the cultural and aesthetic character of Crete remained deeply Minoan. The island had become a meeting ground of two civilizations, the sophisticated maritime culture of the Minoans and the militarized aristocracy of the Mycenaeans. The rebuilding of Knossos under Mycenaean administration preserved much of its architectural grandeur. The palace continued to function as a central administrative hub, coordinating production, storage, and trade. Linear B tablets record the management of goods, land, and personnel with remarkable precision, providing insight into the bureaucratic mechanisms of this hybrid society. The new rulers adopted Minoan systems of governance rather than replacing them outright, recognizing their efficiency. The records describe allocations of grain, textiles, and livestock, indicating a highly organized redistributive economy similar to earlier Minoan models. However, subtle changes reveal the Mycenaean hand. References to wanax, or king, and to warriors and chariot equipment suggest a more hierarchical and militarized administration than before. The Mycenaeans integrated themselves into the established system, reshaping it to reflect their values of control, order, and rank. Art and architecture during this period continued the Minoan tradition, but with noticeable modifications. Frescoes retain the vibrant colors and fluid forms characteristic of earlier centuries, yet themes gradually shifted. Scenes of ritual and nature remained, but representations of processions, weaponry, and heraldic symbols became more frequent. The Mycenaeans admired Minoan artistry and employed local craftsmen to decorate their own palaces on the mainland in similar style. This fusion produced a shared Aegean aesthetic that would later define the Late Bronze Age. At Knossos, wall paintings still displayed dolphins, lilies, and acrobats, but their arrangement and purpose became more formalized, reflecting the tastes of an imported elite. The once communal expression of art had become an instrument of authority and identity. Religion, too, adapted to new realities. Minoan cult symbols, the double axe, the sacred horns, and the goddess figures, remained central, but Mycenaean elements appeared alongside them. The Linear B tablets mention deities familiar from later Greek religion: Poseidon, Zeus, and Hera. These names mark the earliest written evidence of the gods who would dominate Greek mythology, suggesting that Mycenaean rulers incorporated local Minoan beliefs into a broader pantheon. The fusion of divine traditions illustrates how cultural continuity survived through adaptation. Shrines and sanctuaries continued to function, and rituals likely maintained their connection to fertility, nature, and renewal, though under a different ideological framework. The result was not cultural extinction, but transformation, a blending of spiritual systems that bridged two civilizations. Economically, the Mycenaean presence reinvigorated trade but altered its direction. While the earlier Minoan thalassocracy had prioritized balanced exchange across the Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans approached commerce with strategic and political intent. Knossos became an administrative outpost within a network of Mycenaean-controlled centers. Ships sailed from Cretan ports to Cyprus and the Levant, but their cargoes now served a hierarchical empire rather than an island federation. The evidence from Linear B tablets shows that goods were collected, cataloged, and redistributed according to royal authority. This shift from cooperative trade to command economy foreshadowed the more rigid social structures of later Greek kingdoms. Nonetheless, Crete's maritime skills and geographic position ensured its continued importance in regional exchange. Daily life for most inhabitants of Crete likely changed gradually rather than abruptly. Villages remained active, agricultural production continued, and traditional crafts persisted. The rural population maintained customs that predated Mycenaean control, especially in remote areas beyond the direct reach of palace administration. Pottery styles diversified, combining Minoan elegance with mainland sturdiness. Tombs and burial customs, however, began to reflect Mycenaean influence, with the appearance of shaft graves and chamber tombs. These changes indicate a growing stratification of society and the presence of warrior elites whose status was reinforced in death as in life. Knossos during this era functioned as the central seat of power not only for Crete, but perhaps for a wider Aegean realm. Its archives demonstrate an administrative reach that extended across the island, collecting taxes, managing estates, and controlling production. The efficiency of this bureaucracy suggests that Mycenaean officials maintained Minoan scribes and artisans in their service. The coexistence of Greek-speaking administrators and Minoan workers created a bilingual environment where traditions blended in daily practice. While Linear B recorded official business, Minoan religious imagery and rituals persisted in local contexts, ensuring that the island's original identity did not vanish entirely. By the 14th century BCE, however, signs of decline began to appear. Archaeological layers show increasing signs of neglect and disrepair in palace infrastructure. Storerooms were left half-empty, archives abandoned, and workshops relocated. Some scholars attribute this to internal instability, perhaps as Mycenaean control weakened or local elites competed for power. Others point to the broader upheavals sweeping the eastern Mediterranean during this time: disruptions in trade, migrations, and climatic stresses that strained complex economies. Whatever the causes, Crete's once cohesive administrative system began to fragment. The destruction of Knossos around 1375 BC marked the end of centralized authority on the island. The palace was abandoned, never to be rebuilt on the same scale. Without its administrative core, Crete's economy and social organization reverted to regional structures. Villages and small towns persisted, but the island's role as a maritime hub diminished. The Mycenaeans retained some presence, as evidenced by continued use of linear B in isolated sites, yet the unified system of governance had collapsed. The last phase of the Minoan-Mycenaean fusion gave way to localized autonomy and eventual obscurity. Culturally, this transition had lasting consequences. Even as the administrative state disappeared, Minoan artistic and religious traditions continued to influence the Aegean world. The Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, particularly at Pylos and Tiryns, incorporated architectural features pioneered in Crete: columned halls, light wells, and storage magazines. The concept of the palace as both economic and ceremonial center spread throughout Greece, shaping later conceptions of governance. The imagery of spirals, marine motifs, and nature-based patterns persisted in pottery and decorative arts long after Crete's decline. Through Mycenaean adaptation, Minoan culture became a foundation stone of the wider Greek world. One of the most significant legacies of this era is linguistic. The linear B tablets, preserved by the fires that destroyed Knossos, provide the earliest written evidence of the Greek language. They illuminate aspects of administration, economy, and religion that would otherwise remain unknown. Through them, historians can trace the continuity between Bronze Age bureaucracy and later classical traditions. The survival of these texts underscores how a moment of destruction can become a moment of preservation, accidentally safeguarding the records of a vanished world. In the centuries following the fall of Knossos, Crete entered a period of decentralization. The island's population dispersed into smaller settlements, and international trade waned. Yet the cultural memory of its palatial grandeur endured. Mycenaean elites on the mainland continued to revere the island's achievements, and later Greek myths would remember Crete as the land of King Minos and the labyrinth, a distant echo of the palace's winding corridors. The mythic memory, though transformed by storytelling, preserved fragments of historical reality. Behind the legend of the Minotaur lay the architectural complexity of Knossos. Behind the name Minos stood generations of Minoan and Mycenaean rulers who had governed from its courts. The hybrid phase of Crete's history, marked by Mycenaean dominance and Minoan persistence, thus serves as a bridge between two worlds. It linked the vibrant maritime culture of the Bronze Age Aegean with the emerging structures that would define the early Greek kingdoms. Through adaptation rather than annihilation, Minoan traditions survived their political downfall, continuing to influence language, religion, and art across the Aegean for centuries to come. As the Mycenaean age unfolded and ultimately collapsed itself, the echoes of Crete civilization would remain embedded in the collective memory of the region, shaping the foundations of what would one day be known as the Greek world. The fall of Knossos around 1375 BC marked a decisive rupture in Cretan history. The destruction of its last great palace ended more than a millennium of centralized governance, trade coordination, and cultural unity. What followed was a long and gradual decline, a slow transformation from an island of palaces, art, and maritime power into a landscape of scattered villages and fading memory. This post-palatial era, extending from roughly 1375 to 1100 BCE, reveals a civilization in transition. The people of Crete did not vanish. They adapted to changing circumstances, preserving fragments of their traditions amid the collapse of complex systems that once bound them together. Archaeology shows that while the palaces fell silent, life continued in reduced form. The island entered a quieter age, one defined not by monumental construction, but by resilience and continuity. In the centuries following the destruction, many former palace centers were abandoned or repurposed. At Knossos, only small portions of the once sprawling complex remained occupied. Administrative activities ceased. The linear B script disappeared with the bureaucrats who had used it. Without the central redistributive system, local communities became self-reliant. The economic interdependence that had characterized Minoan civilization gave way to regional isolation. Pottery production, once standardized and widespread, became local and simpler in design. Decorative motifs lost the finesse of earlier centuries, reflecting a society focused on subsistence rather than display. Yet beneath this surface of regression, there was continuity in settlement, farming, and ritual practice. The Minoans' descendants did not abandon their island. They simply adjusted to a world without centralized order. The causes of this final decline remain complex and multifaceted. Natural disasters, such as earthquakes, had repeatedly struck Crete throughout its history. The Thera eruption a century earlier had already destabilized trade and agriculture. Environmental stress may have compounded these effects. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, or shifting climate patterns could have undermined productivity. More decisive, however, were the geopolitical changes sweeping the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of the Mycenaean kingdoms on the mainland around 1200 BCE, part of a wider collapse that engulfed nearly every major Bronze Age power, isolated Crete from its trading partners. Maritime routes that once linked the Aegean to Egypt and the Levant broke down amid conflict and migration. The Sea Peoples, mentioned in Egyptian records, may have contributed to this instability, disrupting commerce and threatening coastal settlements. Crete, no longer a hub of exchange, retreated into itself. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a marked decline in material wealth. Imported goods became rare, indicating that international trade had diminished or ceased altogether. Settlements grew smaller and more defensible, often situated on hilltops rather than open plains. The shift in settlement patterns suggests insecurity and a growing need for protection. Metalwork declined in quality, and the elaborate frescoes and luxury objects of earlier centuries disappeared. Yet certain aspects of Minoan culture persisted. The tradition of fine pottery continued in simplified form, and religious symbols, particularly the double axe and the sacred horns, remained in use, albeit in localized contexts. The persistence of these motifs testifies to cultural memory surviving through adaptation, even as external connections faded. Burial customs offer insight into the social transformations of this era. In place of elaborate tombs and grave goods associated with elite classes, the post-palatial burials are modest, emphasizing continuity rather than hierarchy. Communal cemeteries replaced the individualized burials of earlier rulers, reflecting a more egalitarian social order. This change suggests the dissolution of the palatial elite and the emergence of smaller, kin-based communities governed by local leaders. While literacy disappeared with the loss of the palace administrations, oral traditions likely flourished, preserving collective memory in story and ritual. In this way, cultural identity endured even as the institutional framework of civilization dissolved. Despite decline, Crete did not become isolated entirely. Archaeological finds reveal limited contact with Cyprus, the Dodecanese, and the Levant, showing that maritime connections, though diminished, never vanished completely. The island's geographic position continued to offer access to eastern trade routes, albeit at a reduced scale. This residual exchange helped sustain craftsmanship and introduced new cultural influences. Some pottery styles of the late Bronze Age III period show traces of Cypriot and Near Eastern design, indicating that Crete participated in a fragmentary but ongoing network of communication. The reduced scale of these exchanges, however, reflects a world that had turned inward, focused on survival rather than expansion. Religious life persisted as a vital link to the island's past. Small sanctuaries continued to function, often located on mountaintops or in caves, places that had long held spiritual significance. These shrines maintained older traditions while gradually incorporating new elements. Offerings of figurines, pottery, and small votive objects suggest that communities continued to honor deities associated with fertility, harvest, and protection. The shift from grand temple palace rituals to intimate local worship mirrors the decentralization of society itself. Religion, once organized through the palatial centers, became the spiritual glue that held small communities together. In continuity of worship, the Minoan sense of harmony between human and natural worlds survived, even in diminished circumstances. Knossos, though largely abandoned as a palace, remained a symbolic center throughout the post-palatial period. Small-scale habitation continued on and around the site, maintaining a tenuous link to its illustrious past. Other settlements, such as Carfi in eastern Crete, emerged as new centers of habitation. Built high in the mountains, Carfi reflects a population seeking refuge and security. The site's architecture, simple stone houses clustered around communal spaces, represents a practical adaptation to new realities. Despite the modest scale, evidence of religious figurines and household shrines indicates that even in isolation, the spirit of Minoan ritual life endured. By the 12th century BCE, the wider Aegean world had entered what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a systemic breakdown that affected trade, literacy, and state authority from Anatolia to Egypt. Crete, once the pioneer of Aegean civilization, now shared the fate of its neighbors. The island's population declined, and many coastal areas were abandoned. The Mycenaean influence that had shaped the preceding centuries disappeared, leaving a cultural vacuum slowly filled by emerging Greek-speaking communities. These early settlers, possibly descendants of both Minoans and incoming groups from the mainland, would eventually give rise to the distinct Cretan identity of the early Iron Age. In material culture, this transition is visible in the shift from finely crafted Minoan pottery to the simpler, handmade wares of the sub-Minoan period. Decoration became minimal, focusing on functional rather than aesthetic qualities. Bronze, once abundant, grew scarce, and tools and weapons increasingly relied on iron. This technological shift marked the dawn of a new era, though its early stages were marked by austerity. The people of Crete adapted to scarcity with pragmatism, repurposing materials and techniques from their ancestors to meet new needs. Through such adaptability, cultural survival was ensured. The memory of the Minoan palaces lingered long after their fall. Generations later, Greek poets and historians would recall the island as the seat of King Minos and the home of the labyrinth. These legends, recorded centuries after the events they dimly reflected, preserved echoes of Minoan grandeur. The image of a powerful ruler presiding over a labyrinthine palace corresponds strikingly to the archaeological reality of Knossos. The myth of the Minotaur, half man and half bull, may have originated in distant memories of bull-leaping rituals or the religious symbolism of earlier centuries. In myth, the Minoans achieved a form of immortality. Their story survived long after their civilization had vanished from history. By around 1100 BCE, Crete had completed its transition from Bronze Age powerhouse to a modest participant in the emerging Iron Age world. The island's population stabilized, and new forms of community began to develop. Though the Minoan language and script were gone, many elements of its culture, artistic motifs, architectural techniques, and religious traditions, were absorbed into the evolving Greek world. The Minoans' legacy thus persisted not as a vanished people, but as a formative influence. Their innovations in architecture, trade, and administration became part of the foundation upon which later Greek civilization was built. The post-palatial decline of Crete stands as a testament to both fragility and endurance. The collapse of centralized power did not erase the identity of its people, it transformed it. Out of loss came adaptation, and through adaptation came continuity. The Minoan spirit, the blend of artistry, organization, and reverence for life, survived beneath the surface of later cultures. In time, as Greece reemerged into literacy and statehood, traces of Crete's earliest civilization would reappear in language, myth, and design. The island's quiet centuries after the fall of Knossos thus form not merely an epilogue, but the bridge between the Bronze Age and the dawn of the classical world. Centuries after the collapse of the Minoan palatial world, Crete entered a long period of transformation that gradually connected its surviving traditions with the emerging cultures of the Greek mainland. Between 1100 and 700 BCE, the island transitioned from isolated post-palatial villages into a network of small, independent communities. This period, sometimes called the Early Iron Age or Sub-Minoan, Proto-Geometric Era, marked the quiet survival and slow rebirth of Cretan society. While the grandeur of Knossos and Phaistos was gone, the island's population retained memory, methods, and symbols of its ancient past. Over these centuries, Crete became a bridge between worlds, preserving Bronze Age heritage while contributing to the rise of early Greek civilization. Archaeological evidence from this period paints a picture of continuity amid modest living conditions. Settlements remained small, often fortified and situated inland for protection. Architecture was functional, built from stone with wooden reinforcements. Homes were single-story and simple in layout, clustered around central courtyards or communal areas. Despite their simplicity, these settlements reveal social organization and cooperation. Excavations at sites such as Carfi, Kavusi, and Prazos demonstrate stable agricultural economies based on grain, olives, and livestock. While metal resources were scarce, local production of iron tools gradually replaced the bronze technology of earlier centuries, signaling adaptation to new realities. This technological shift laid the foundation for economic recovery in the following generations. The absence of writing during this era marks one of its most significant differences from the Minoan and Mycenaean ages. The linear A and B scripts disappeared entirely, leaving Crete in what historians call a dark age. Yet this term oversimplifies the reality. Cultural life persisted through oral tradition, craftsmanship, and religious continuity. Pottery styles evolved in new directions, displaying geometric designs that would later influence mainland Greek art. Burial practices also changed. Cemeteries such as those at Knossos and Fortezza reveal extended family tombs, where generations were interred together, reflecting strong kinship bonds and stable lineage-based communities. Religion remained central to daily life, linking this period to its Minoan roots. Shrines in caves and on mountaintops continued to receive offerings, indicating that sacred sites retained their significance long after the fall of the palaces. Figurines of goddesses, animals, and worshippers have been found in these sanctuaries, showing that people maintained older symbols of fertility, nature, and protection. While the scale of worship was smaller and more local, its persistence suggests an enduring spiritual worldview. Over time, some of these deities may have merged with or influenced the emerging Greek pantheon. Scholars often note that the later Greek goddess Rhea, associated with Mount Ida and Crete, likely inherited attributes from Minoan mother goddess traditions. During the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Crete began to re-engage with the wider Aegean world. Contact with Euboea, the Cyclades, and even the Near East resumed through limited trade. Imported pottery and bronze objects appear once again in Cretan contexts, indicating renewed maritime exchange. The island's position in the eastern Mediterranean made it a convenient stop for merchants traveling between Greece and the Levant. Through these interactions, Crete absorbed new artistic styles and technological innovations, particularly in metallurgy and weaving. The reintroduction of foreign goods rekindled local craftsmanship, stimulating economic and cultural growth after centuries of isolation. This period also witnessed the gradual reemergence of literacy. By the 8th century BCE, the Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician script, appeared in the Aegean, and Crete was among the first regions to adopt it. Early inscriptions found on pottery fragments from sites like Drairos and Prazos provide evidence of this revival. One notable inscription from Drairos, dated to around 650 BCE, records a civic law, making it one of the earliest known written legal texts in the Greek world. The presence of such inscriptions demonstrates not only the return of writing, but also the rise of organized civic institutions. This development signaled the island's full integration into the emerging Hellenic world. Cretan society in this era displayed strong communal organization. Villages and towns developed local councils or assemblies that managed shared affairs. The Drairos inscription implies a structured legal code and the presence of magistrates, suggesting an early form of self-governing polis. These civic structures reflect continuity with older traditions of collective decision-making, perhaps rooted in the cooperative agricultural systems of the Bronze Age. Over time, several of these communities evolved into fully formed city-states, including Gortyn, Lidos, and Knossos. Unlike the heavily urbanized Mycenaean centers, these Cretan polis were modest in scale but deeply rooted in local identity and tradition. Cultural life flourished as stability returned. Pottery of the geometric period shows increasing sophistication, with symmetrical patterns and carefully proportioned decoration. The motifs, circles, meanders, and spirals, recall abstract forms from earlier Minoan art, adapted to the tastes of a new age. Sculpture reemerged in small bronze figurines depicting warriors, animals, and worshippers. These objects were often dedicated at sanctuaries, reflecting both artistic revival and religious devotion. At the same time, oral traditions that had preserved fragments of the Minoan past began to merge with the evolving myths of the Greek world. Stories of Minos, the labyrinth, and the bull took on new life, now interpreted through a Hellenic lens. Crete's political structure during this period was characterized by diversity. Some regions, such as Gortyn, developed oligarchic systems governed by councils of elders. Others maintained more aristocratic rule, dominated by a few powerful families. Military organization also evolved. Citizen militias replaced the professional guards of palace times, and defense became a shared civic duty. This model anticipated the hoplite systems that would later define the classical Greek polis. In this sense, Crete served as a laboratory for early forms of political organization that would later spread across the Aegean. Agriculture and trade formed the basis of economic life. The fertile plains of central and southern Crete supported grain, olives, and vines, while coastal towns engaged in fishing and small-scale trade. Local artisans produced pottery, textiles, and metalwork for domestic use and limited export. The island's strategic location continued to attract contact with visiting merchants from Phoenicia and Cyprus. Through these exchanges, the Cretans absorbed elements of Eastern craftsmanship, especially in jewelry design and metal ornamentation, enriching their artistic repertoire. By the 7th century BCE, Crete had re-established itself as a stable and literate society. The reappearance of monumental architecture, including temples and civic buildings, reflected growing confidence. The sanctuary of Drairos, dedicated to Apollo, exemplifies this new phase. Built of stone and featuring columned halls, it recalls earlier Minoan traditions while incorporating Greek architectural concepts. Religion, law, and community life had become intertwined once more, anchoring the island in a renewed cultural order. Yet Crete's reemergence occurred alongside powerful developments elsewhere in the Greek world. On the mainland, city-states like Sparta, Corinth, and Athens began to dominate regional politics and trade. The Cretans, geographically removed from these centers, retained distinctive customs that set them apart. Their legal codes emphasized moderation, communal discipline, and the regulation of wealth, traits admired by later Greek philosophers such as Plato, who saw in Cretan law a model of early civic virtue. This respect indicates that even as Crete's influence waned politically, its intellectual and institutional legacy endured. The transition from the post-Minoan centuries to the Archaic Age thus represents both survival and transformation. Crete had moved from collapse to reconstruction, from isolation to reintegration. Its communities preserved fragments of the Bronze Age while participating in the dawn of classical civilization. The Minoan achievements in organization, craftsmanship, and maritime skill did not disappear. They evolved, subtly shaping the forms that Greek culture would later take. As the island entered the Archaic and Classical periods, its role shifted from cultural innovator to custodian of ancient heritage. The next phase of its story would see Cretan cities interacting with the wider Greek world through trade, colonization, and law. The civilization that had once dominated the Aegean now contributed its enduring wisdom to a broader Hellenic identity. Through centuries of continuity, Crete remained what it had always been, a bridge between past and future, between the earliest experiments in civilization and the classical age that would define Western history. By the time Crete entered the Archaic and Classical periods, roughly between 700 and 323 BCE, it had become a land of contrasts, proud of its ancient lineage yet peripheral to the main currents of Hellenic power. The Minoan memory lingered in the island's customs, religious practices, and laws, but its society had transformed into a constellation of small, independent city-states. While mainland Greece surged forward through the rise of Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, Crete followed its own path, conservative, disciplined, and self-contained. This was an age of stability and endurance rather than expansion, a time when the island's traditions were codified, its institutions matured, and its culture quietly influenced the wider Greek world. Archaeological and literary evidence from this period reveal that the Cretan polis, among them Gortyn, Knossos, Lidos, and Drairos, maintained distinct political systems but shared a common ethos. Unlike the democratic assemblies of Athens or the imperial ambitions of Corinth, Cretan city-states were governed through a blend of aristocracy and law-bound order. Power typically rested with councils composed of leading families, guided by codified statutes. Civic life revolved around discipline, equality among citizens, and the protection of communal stability. This system preserved ancient ideals of balance and restraint, qualities deeply rooted in the island's long tradition of structured governance stretching back to the Minoan palatial administrations. One of the most remarkable legacies of this era is the Gortyn Code, inscribed on a circular wall in the city of Gortyn during the 5th century BCE. Written in the early Greek alphabet, it records a complex legal system addressing family law, property, inheritance, and social status. The text reveals an organized society governed by rational principles and civic responsibility. It represents the culmination of centuries of gradual institutional development, from the redistributive hierarchies of the Bronze Age to the rational legal frameworks of the classical period. The code's existence demonstrates that, although Crete no longer held political power in the Aegean, it continued to lead intellectually through its commitment to structured justice and civic ethics. Crete's legal traditions were admired by later philosophers and historians. Plato, in his Laws, referenced the Cretan constitution as a model of moral order and civic discipline, drawing parallels between Cretan and Spartan governance. Both systems valued military training, communal upbringing, and moderation in personal conduct. While Sparta achieved greater fame for its martial society, it is likely that many of its customs derived from earlier Cretan precedents. This intellectual continuity links the Minoan concern for organization and balance with the classical Greek ideal of civic virtue. Crete, in this sense, was not a relic but a living repository of ancient institutional wisdom. Economically, Crete during the classical period remained primarily agrarian. The fertile plains near Gortyn, Phaistos, and Lidos supported agriculture based on olives, grain, and vineyards. The island's terrain encouraged small-scale farming and local autonomy, reinforcing the independence of each polis. Trade persisted on a modest scale, with exports of olive oil, wine, and textiles reaching the Aegean and beyond. Crete's strategic location continued to make it a maritime crossroads, though it no longer dominated sea routes as it had in Minoan times. The harbors of Atanos and Hierapytna maintained contact with Egypt and the Levant, showing that Cretan seafaring remained vital even in relative obscurity. Culturally, this was a period of synthesis. The island's artistic production reflected both continuity and adaptation. Pottery and sculpture bore geometric and naturalistic motifs reminiscent of earlier Minoan patterns, yet now expressed in the classical idiom of proportion and restraint. Local sanctuaries remained active, often built on ancient sacred sites that had been used for over 1,000 years. At Phaistos, for instance, a small temple dedicated to Rhea was constructed near the ruins of the old palace, preserving the spiritual lineage of the Minoan mother goddess. Religion in Crete retained its distinctive character, emphasizing fertility, nature, and communal ritual. Deities such as Zeus, said in myth to have been born on Mount Ida, linked the island's pre-Greek traditions to the Olympian pantheon. The persistence of ritual continuity highlights Crete's role as a custodian of ancient spirituality. Cretan ceremonies involve processions, offerings, and dances performed in open-air courtyards, echoing Minoan forms. The symbolism of the double axe, sacred horns, and mountain shrines persisted, reinterpreted through Greek religious frameworks. This blending of old and new traditions gave Cretan worship a unique character within the Greek world, conservative, yet deeply rooted in antiquity. The island's priests and priestesses served as intermediaries between the old Mediterranean cults and the evolving religion of the Hellenes. Socially, Cretan life was organized around discipline and collective identity. Boys underwent communal training known as the Aegoge, designed to instill obedience, endurance, and loyalty to the polis. This institution paralleled the Spartan system and emphasized physical fitness, military readiness, and civic virtue. Cretan society valued modesty, hospitality, and respect for law, traits that ensured internal cohesion but also limited external ambition. Unlike Athens, Crete did not pursue artistic flamboyance or imperial expansion. Its strength lay in endurance and self-regulation. Despite its relative isolation, Crete played a quiet role in the wider Greek world through colonization and cultural exchange. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Cretan settlers founded colonies in the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, including Lyctus and Tarentum. These ventures extended the island's influence and transmitted its traditions abroad. Cretan mercenaries also served in foreign armies, their discipline and skill earning respect from mainland Greeks and Eastern monarchs alike. Through these interactions, Cretan values of order and resilience spread far beyond the island's shores. However, internal rivalries among the Cretan polis often hindered unity. Conflicts between cities such as Knossos and Lidos were frequent, reflecting the competitive ethos of the Greek world. These struggles weakened the island's collective power and prevented it from playing a major political role in Hellenic affairs. While Athens and Sparta engaged in large-scale wars and diplomacy, Crete remained regionally focused, preoccupied with maintaining its traditional institutions. This inward orientation preserved stability but also isolated the island from the intellectual and artistic dynamism of the mainland. The classical period ended with the conquests of Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenistic culture across the Mediterranean. Crete, though unaffected by direct conquest, became increasingly integrated into a larger network of Greek-speaking states. The island's cities adapted to the new realities by participating in alliances and regional leagues. Yet even in this era of change, Crete retained its distinctive local laws and customs, a sign of its enduring cultural independence. By the late 4th century BCE, Crete stood as a repository of ancient order within a rapidly transforming world. While other Greek regions embraced experimentation and empire, the Cretans preserved what they saw as the essentials of civilization: law, moderation, and continuity. The island's institutions, rooted in centuries of adaptation, reflected a civilization that had mastered the art of survival through balance. Crete's story during the classical era is thus not one of conquest or innovation, but of steady preservation, a bridge linking the disciplined hierarchies of the Bronze Age with the civic rationality of the Greek polis. This enduring stability would soon be tested by the turbulent centuries that followed. As the Hellenistic kingdoms rose and Rome began its expansion, Crete would once again find itself at the crossroads of empires. Its ancient traditions would confront new powers and ideologies, forcing the island to redefine its identity while preserving its distinctive legacy. Through this transition, the long arc of Minoan heritage would continue to echo in the evolving story of the Mediterranean world. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE ushered in an era of transformation across the Mediterranean world, and Crete, long a land of inward focus and stable traditions, was drawn into the vast and shifting landscape of Hellenistic power. Over the next 2 centuries, the island's independent city-states were caught between the rival ambitions of great kingdoms: Egypt under the Ptolemies, Macedon under the Antigonids, and the Seleucid Empire to the east. Yet, even as the balance of power changed, Crete's character remained distinct, conservative, fiercely autonomous, and guided by ancient customs. Its geography and political fragmentation ensured that while no single ruler could dominate it easily, internal divisions would prevent unity and ultimately invite foreign intervention. This chapter traces Crete's experience during the Hellenistic period, a time when the island's traditions met the realities of a connected, conflict-driven world. In the early Hellenistic centuries, roughly between 323 and 200 BCE, Crete's cities continued to operate as independent polis, each maintaining its own laws, armies, and alliances. Among the most prominent were Knossos, Gortyn, Lidos, Hierapytna, and Kydonia. These city-states competed for influence, forming and dissolving coalitions according to shifting circumstances. While unity was rare, a sense of shared Cretan identity persisted through common institutions such as religious festivals and mutual legal traditions. Warfare between the cities was frequent but ritualized, conducted within a framework that still valued law and negotiation. The continuity of local autonomy, even amid broader geopolitical turbulence, reflects the island's deep-rooted attachment to self-governance. The outside world, however, increasingly turned its attention toward Crete. The island's strategic location at the junction of Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean routes made it a valuable prize for the successors of Alexander. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, seeking to control maritime trade, established influence over several Cretan ports. Archaeological evidence from Atanos and other eastern coastal sites shows strong Egyptian connections during this period, including imported goods and temple dedications to Egyptian deities such as Isis and Serapis. These cults spread across the island, blending with local traditions and reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of the Hellenistic age. Crete, though politically fragmented, became culturally integrated into a wider Mediterranean network of commerce and religion. The island's maritime reputation also grew during this era, though not always favorably. By the 3rd century BCE, Cretan sailors were renowned, and sometimes notorious, for their seafaring skill and opportunism. The chronic instability of the Hellenistic world created ample opportunity for piracy, and many Cretans turned to privateering as a means of livelihood. Ancient sources, including Polybius, describe Crete as a center of piracy, its harbors serving as bases for fleets that raided merchant vessels across the Aegean. While these accounts reflect the prejudices of mainland Greeks, they contain elements of truth. Piracy, trade, and mercenary activity often overlapped, forming an integral part of the island's economy. In a region dominated by warring empires, Crete's fragmented political structure allowed it to thrive in the shadows of larger powers. Yet piracy was only one side of Cretan maritime enterprise. The same skills that enabled raiding also supported legitimate commerce. Cretan merchants traded olive oil, wine, and textiles with Rhodes, Egypt, and Cyprus. Knossos and Hierapytna prospered as export centers, and local craftsmen produced goods tailored to foreign markets. The circulation of Cretan coins across the Aegean testifies to active economic exchange. These coins, bearing distinctive symbols such as the labyrinth or the Minotaur, reveal both civic pride and the enduring memory of the island's ancient heritage. In economic terms, Crete in the Hellenistic age was far from stagnant. It adapted skillfully to the currents of a globalized Mediterranean. The internal political landscape, however, remained volatile. The rivalry between Knossos and Lidos, in particular, defined much of the island's history during the 3rd century BCE. Both cities sought to expand their alliances and influence smaller polis. In 220 BCE, a major conflict known as the Lycian War broke out when Knossos and its allies attacked Lidos, leading to the destruction of the latter. The war drew in neighboring cities and even external powers, including the Macedonians and the Aetolian League. Although Knossos emerged as the leading city for a time, the devastation weakened the island as a whole and exposed it to further external manipulation. This pattern, temporary dominance followed by renewed fragmentation, characterized Cretan politics for centuries. Amid the turbulence, the Cretan legal and social order persisted. The island continued to emphasize communal discipline and equality among citizens. Inscriptions from Gortyn and other cities show laws regulating property, marriage, and military service, demonstrating continuity from earlier traditions. The endurance of these codes amid external pressure underscores the deep institutional stability that defined Cretan society. Even as alliances shifted and wars erupted, civic order remained anchored in law. This balance between adaptability and conservatism allowed Cretan communities to survive repeated crises. Religion during the Hellenistic period reflected both continuity and cosmopolitanism. The worship of Zeus, particularly in his Cretan form as Zeus Velchanos, remained central, as did local deities associated with mountains and fertility. At the same time, new cults arrived from abroad. The Egyptian goddess Isis gained popularity, often identified with local mother goddess figures. The cult of Serapis, associated with healing and the afterlife, spread through coastal cities linked to Egyptian trade. This blending of traditions illustrates Crete's role as a cultural crossroads, a place where ancient Mediterranean beliefs mingled with Hellenistic innovations. Religious syncretism enriched local culture, maintaining the spiritual vitality that had always been central to Cretan life. Cretan mercenaries became another defining feature of the period. Valued for their discipline and skill, they served in armies across the Hellenistic world, from Egypt to Syria to the Peloponnese. For many young men, mercenary service provided both income and adventure, as well as exposure to the broader Mediterranean. Their reputation was such that Cretan archers became a recognized military class, famed for precision and reliability. These soldiers acted as informal ambassadors of Cretan culture, spreading elements of their homeland's discipline and ethos far beyond its shores. Through them, Crete maintained a subtle but significant influence in the affairs of larger states. By the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, Crete's internal rivalries and maritime activities began to draw the attention of a new rising power, Rome. Initially, Roman involvement in the Aegean was limited to protecting trade routes and suppressing piracy. However, as Rome's influence expanded after its victories over Macedon and the Seleucid Empire, Crete's strategic location became increasingly important. The island's fragmented politics made it an attractive target for Roman diplomacy and intervention. Rome positioned itself as the arbiter of regional disputes, gradually tightening its grip through alliances and punitive expeditions. The turning point came in the mid-2nd century BCE, when Cretan piracy and resistance to Roman authority prompted a series of confrontations. The most decisive was the Cretan War, 69 to 67 BCE, in which Roman forces under Quintus Caecilius Metellus invaded the island. Despite fierce resistance from Cretan cities, including Knossos and Hieropytna, Rome's superior organization and military power prevailed. By 67 BCE, Crete was formally annexed as part of the Roman province of Cyrene and Crete. The island's independence, preserved for centuries through diplomacy and internal balance, had finally come to an end. The Roman conquest marked both an end and a beginning. It concluded over 1,000 years of continuous self-rule, yet ensured that Cretan traditions would survive within a new imperial framework. The island's legal codes, social customs, and religious practices continued under Roman oversight, testifying to the resilience of its cultural identity. In many ways, Crete adapted smoothly to Roman administration. Its cities retained local councils, and its ports became part of the Mediterranean trade network once more, now under Roman protection. The Hellenistic age thus represents a final flowering of Cretan independence before absorption into empire. It was a period of conflict and creativity, decline and adaptation, continuity and transformation. The island's laws, maritime skill, and cultural traditions persisted even amid political weakness. Crete entered the Roman world not as a conquered backwater, but as a land bearing one of the oldest and most continuous traditions of civic life in the Mediterranean. The next chapter of its story would unfold under Roman rule, where its ancient heritage would find new expression within the stability of imperial peace. Under Roman rule, Crete entered a new epoch, one of imperial stability, administrative integration, and cultural adaptation. After centuries of internal rivalry and maritime turbulence, the island now found itself part of a vast and enduring empire that stretched from Britain to Syria. The Roman conquest, completed by Quintus Caecilius Metellus in 67 BCE, was decisive but not catastrophic. Rather than erasing local identity, Roman governance absorbed and reorganized it. For Crete, long defined by its independence and internal diversity, this was both a loss and an opportunity. The centuries that followed saw the transformation of its cities, economy, and culture under Roman influence, while ancient traditions continued to shape daily life. The Roman period in Crete, lasting from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE, represents one of adaptation, prosperity, and gradual transition toward the Christian and Byzantine worlds that followed. The new province of Crete and Cyrene was established shortly after Metellus's campaign, combining the island with territories in modern-day Libya. The arrangement reflected Roman administrative pragmatism rather than geographical coherence, but it placed Crete firmly under the authority of a Roman proconsul. The provincial capital alternated between Gortyn and Cyrene, though Gortyn quickly emerged as the administrative center for the island. Archaeological remains from Gortyn reveal large-scale public works from this era, a Roman forum, baths, and temples, signaling its elevated status. The famous Great Code of Gortyn, an inscription preserving the city's ancient legal traditions, continued to hold moral and historical value, illustrating the Romans' respect for local customs even as they imposed their own systems. In economic terms, the island benefited from the Pax Romana, the long period of relative peace that facilitated trade and communication across the empire. Cretan ports once associated with piracy now became legitimate hubs of commerce. Knossos, though diminished politically, prospered as a trading center, while Gortyn flourished as the provincial capital. Agricultural production expanded, particularly in olive oil, wine, and grain, which were exported to Italy and Egypt. Roman roads linked inland valleys to coastal markets, improving internal cohesion that had eluded earlier eras. The Roman policy of integration through infrastructure left a lasting mark on the island's landscape, traces of which remain visible in the modern countryside. Cretan society under Rome remained structured around city-states, but these now operated within a unified legal and fiscal framework. Roman citizenship gradually extended to local elites, creating a class of provincial aristocrats who balanced loyalty to Rome with pride in Cretan heritage. Many families adopted Roman names while continuing to honor local deities. Latin inscriptions appeared alongside Greek, signaling bilingual administration. The blend of Roman and Greek cultural forms gave Crete a hybrid identity, neither fully Hellenic nor fully Roman, but distinctively provincial. This duality became a hallmark of life in the eastern provinces of the empire. Religion also reflected this cultural synthesis. The traditional worship of Zeus, Hera, and local mountain gods persisted, often adapted to Roman forms. Temples were rededicated to Romanized deities or to the imperial cult, which honored the emperor as a divine protector of the state. At Gortyn, inscriptions and statues attest to the veneration of Augustus and subsequent emperors. Yet local beliefs remained vital. Rural sanctuaries dedicated to Cretan forms of Zeus and Rhea continued to attract worshippers, showing the endurance of sacred geography rooted in prehistory. Over time, Roman and local pantheons merged, embodying the inclusive spiritual character of the empire. Cultural life thrived during this period of relative prosperity. Public entertainment, including theaters, gymnasia, and athletic games, reflected the Roman emphasis on civic spectacle. Amphitheaters were constructed in Gortyn and Knossos, hosting performances and events that reinforced civic unity. Inscriptions commemorate benefactors who financed these structures, suggesting a civic pride deeply compatible with Roman ideals of public life. Education also flourished. Greek remained the language of scholarship, and Cretan intellectuals participated in the broader currents of Greco-Roman philosophy. The fusion of classical education and imperial stability nurtured a provincial culture both sophisticated and locally grounded. Roman rule also brought profound changes in daily life. Urban planning followed standardized Roman models, with forums, baths, aqueducts, and paved streets transforming ancient cities into modern provincial centers. The introduction of Roman engineering techniques, such as vaulted construction and concrete, enabled the creation of large public buildings and durable infrastructure. Domestic architecture likewise evolved. Houses incorporated atriums and peristyles, reflecting Roman tastes adapted to local materials and climate. These tangible transformations symbolize the integration of Crete into the wider Roman world, not through conquest alone, but through shared habits and technologies. However, Roman peace was not absolute. The island experienced occasional unrest, particularly in connection with wider imperial crises. During the 1st century CE, revolts among Jewish communities in Cyrene and neighboring regions affected the province of Crete as well, prompting reassertions of Roman control. Earthquakes, a recurring natural hazard in the region, caused significant damage to cities such as Gortyn and Knossos, necessitating rebuilding efforts that further Romanized the urban fabric. Nonetheless, these disruptions were temporary, and the overall trajectory remained one of integration and recovery. By the 2nd century CE, under emperors such as Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, Crete enjoyed a high degree of prosperity. Hadrian's travels in the Greek East likely included visits to the island, and his cultural policies encouraged local identity within the imperial framework. The construction of new temples, theaters, and public buildings during this era reflects both imperial patronage and local initiative. The economy remained strong, supported by agricultural exports and the steady flow of imperial investment. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and coin hoards, indicates an active monetary economy and participation in Mediterranean trade networks. Yet beneath the surface of stability, subtle transformations were underway. The spread of Christianity, initially a marginal movement within the empire, gradually reached Crete by the late 1st century CE. According to tradition, the Apostle Titus, a companion of Paul, established the first Christian communities on the island. While historical verification of this account is limited, it reflects an early association between Crete and Christian evangelism. Over the next 2 centuries, Christianity spread among urban populations, coexisting with traditional paganism. Inscriptions from the 3rd and 4th centuries CE attest to Christian presence, while the construction of early basilicas marks the beginning of a new religious landscape. The decline of Roman power in the 3rd century CE brought challenges to all provinces, and Crete was no exception. Political instability, external invasions, and economic disruption affected Mediterranean trade. Earthquakes and local revolts further strained resources. Yet the island's relative isolation protected it from the worst of the empire's crises. While neighboring regions suffered from barbarian incursions, Crete remained largely secure. Its agricultural base provided resilience, and its ports continued to serve as waypoints for commerce between Greece, Egypt, and North Africa. As the 4th century unfolded, the Roman Empire itself underwent a profound transformation with the establishment of Constantinople and the spread of Christianity as the state religion. Crete, once a remote province, now found itself closer to the new imperial center of the eastern Mediterranean. Administrative reforms under Diocletian and Constantine restructured provincial governance, separating Crete from Cyrene and placing it within the Diocese of Mysia under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Empire. This shift foreshadowed the island's eventual integration into the Byzantine world. The Christianization of Crete accelerated during this period. Pagan temples were gradually converted into churches, and local cults faded into memory. The continuity of sacred sites, however, reveals the deep-rooted spiritual geography of the island. Many early churches were built on or near ancient sanctuaries, symbolically linking the old and new faiths. The city of Gortyn, long the administrative heart of Roman Crete, became an episcopal center, and the memory of Saint Titus, venerated as the island's first bishop, cemented its Christian identity. By the late 4th century CE, Crete stood fully integrated into the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. Its cities retained their Roman infrastructure but now served as centers of Christian governance and culture. The transition from pagan to Christian society was gradual rather than abrupt, marked by coexistence and adaptation rather than conflict. The endurance of civic traditions, even as their religious foundations shifted, reflects the island's capacity to absorb change without losing continuity. The Roman centuries on Crete thus represent a synthesis, an era when ancient customs met imperial systems, when independence yielded to order, and when pagan sanctuaries gave way to Christian churches without erasing the memory of what came before. The island's transformation under Rome was profound but evolutionary, shaped less by conquest than by the steady influence of law, infrastructure, and culture. As the ancient world faded and the Byzantine Age dawned, Crete's long history of adaptation prepared it to endure. The next chapter would see the island's role within the Byzantine Empire, a continuation of its ancient heritage within a new political and religious order that would define the Mediterranean for centuries to come. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, Crete found itself firmly within the Eastern realm that would become known as the Byzantine Empire, a Christian empire centered in Constantinople. The transition was not abrupt but gradual, shaped by the same patterns of adaptation that had defined the island's history for millennia. Crete, positioned between Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt, now became a strategic maritime province of Byzantium, serving as both a frontier and a bridge between the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean world. Under Byzantine rule, Crete experienced cycles of prosperity and hardship, periods of peace and flourishing trade alternating with times of invasion, isolation, and recovery. Yet, through these fluctuations, the island retained its distinct identity, preserving the legacy of its ancient civilizations within a Christian imperial framework. In the early Byzantine centuries, roughly from the 5th to the 7th century, Crete was a stable and valuable province. Its cities, Gortyn, Knossos, and Kydonia, remained active centers of administration and religion. Gortyn, still the provincial capital, housed the seat of the metropolitan bishop, who oversaw ecclesiastical affairs across the island. Christianity had become the dominant faith, but the memory of earlier traditions lingered in place names, rural rituals, and reused architectural forms. Many temples from the Roman period were converted into churches, their columns and stones incorporated into new basilicas. This physical and spiritual continuity reflects the gradual Christianization of daily life, achieved not by destruction but by transformation. Economically, Crete continued to benefit from its fertile land and central location. The Byzantine administration maintained the agricultural infrastructure inherited from Rome, terraces, irrigation systems, and storage facilities, ensuring the steady production of olive oil, wine, and grain. These goods supported both local consumption and regional trade. The island's ports connected it to Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Aegean Islands, forming part of a commercial network that sustained the empire's maritime economy. Crete's position also made it a vital stop for fleets traveling between the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean, a role that brought prosperity but also exposure to danger. By the 6th century, Byzantine Crete reached a new phase of consolidation. The reign of Emperor Justinian I, 527 to 565 CE, marked a high point of imperial ambition and reform. Under Justinian, Crete was reorganized administratively, and new fortifications were built to protect its coasts and cities. Archaeological remains from this period, including churches adorned with mosaics and fortified settlements in the interior, attest to both imperial investment and local vitality. The spread of Christianity deepened, and Cretan bishops attended major ecumenical councils, linking the island's church to the theological debates of the wider empire. The basilicas of Gortyn, Eleuthera, and Chersonissos exemplify the artistic and architectural sophistication of this era, blending Roman construction techniques with emerging Byzantine aesthetics. Despite its prosperity, Crete was not immune to external pressures. The 7th century brought a series of upheavals that transformed the Mediterranean world. The rise of Islam and the Arab conquest disrupted traditional trade routes and challenged Byzantine naval supremacy. Egypt, once a close trading partner, fell under Arab control, severing a key link in Crete's economic network. Pirate raids became increasingly frequent as Arab fleets probed the Aegean in search of plunder and strategic bases. The Byzantines responded by strengthening coastal defenses and reorganizing the island's administration under the theme system, a military and fiscal structure designed to maintain order in frontier provinces. Crete became part of the theme of the Aegean Sea, governed by a strategos who combined civil and military authority. The 8th century saw further turbulence, both political and religious. The period of iconoclasm, the imperial campaign against religious images, divided the Byzantine world. While evidence from Crete is limited, inscriptions and church remains suggest that the island was not isolated from the controversy. The destruction or alteration of church mosaics during this period reflects the reach of imperial decrees. Yet local traditions of craftsmanship and devotion endured, and when the veneration of icons was restored in the 9th century, Cretan churches once again became centers of artistic expression. The greatest crisis of Byzantine Crete came in the early 9th century, when Arab forces from Andalusia and North Africa invaded the island. Around 824 CE, a group of exiled Andalusian Arabs, expelled from Spain, captured Crete and established an independent emirate centered at Chandax, modern Heraklion. The fall of Crete was a major blow to Byzantium, both strategically and psychologically. For more than a century, the island remained under Arab control, serving as a base for raids across the Aegean. The Emirate of Crete became a center of piracy and commerce, connecting the Islamic world with Mediterranean trade networks. Archaeological traces of this period, including fortifications and coinage, reveal a society that combined Islamic administration with a degree of local continuity. The Byzantine Empire launched repeated campaigns to recover Crete, but the island's defenses and distance from Constantinople made it difficult to retake. It was not until 961 CE, under the command of the general Nikephoros Phocas, that the Byzantines succeeded. Phocas led a massive expedition, besieged Chandax, and after months of fighting, restored Crete to imperial rule. His victory was celebrated as a triumph of Christendom, marking the re-establishment of Byzantine authority in the central Mediterranean. The reconquest initiated a new era of reconstruction and Christian renewal. Churches were rebuilt, monasteries founded, and the administration reorganized. The island was re-Christianized under imperial supervision, with bishops and monks playing a key role in restoring Byzantine culture and faith. The centuries following the reconquest saw Crete prosper once more. The 10th and 11th centuries were periods of relative stability and integration. The Byzantines established new towns and fortified sites, while monastic life flourished in both rural and urban areas. The monastery of Arcadi, later famous in Cretan history, may have originated during this period. Artistic production revived, with frescoes and icons reflecting the stylistic trends of the Macedonian Renaissance. The blending of local artistic traditions with imperial influences produced a distinctive Cretan-Byzantine style that would continue for centuries. Cretan society under the restored Byzantine administration was a blend of continuity and renewal. The landholding system combined state estates with private and monastic property, ensuring a stable agricultural base. The church became the principal cultural institution, preserving learning and literacy through scriptoria and schools. Greek remained the dominant language, though traces of earlier Latin and Arabic influence persisted in place names and vocabulary. The island's population, diverse after centuries of conquest and migration, gradually coalesced under the unifying framework of Orthodox Christianity. By the 12th century, however, the Byzantine world began to face new challenges. The empire's authority weakened under internal strife and external threats from Normans, Venetians, and Crusaders. Crete's strategic location once again made it a coveted prize. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade captured Constantinople, fragmenting the Byzantine Empire and dividing its territories among Western powers. Crete was claimed by the Republic of Venice, marking the beginning of another major transformation in its history, one that would fuse Byzantine heritage with Western European governance and commerce. The Byzantine centuries had reshaped Crete profoundly. From a Roman province to an Arab emirate and back to a Christian stronghold, the island had experienced nearly every form of Mediterranean rule. Through these cycles of loss and renewal, it preserved the essence of its identity, local autonomy, agricultural endurance, and cultural adaptability. The Byzantine legacy would endure long after political control shifted, providing the foundation for the next era of Venetian dominion and the continued blending of East and West that defined Crete's enduring story. The Venetian conquest of Crete in the early 13th century marked the beginning of a new chapter in the island's long history of cultural transformation. When the forces of the Fourth Crusade captured Constantinople in 1204 and divided the Byzantine Empire's territories among the victors, Crete was initially claimed by Boniface of Montferrat, one of the Crusade's leaders. He quickly sold it to the Republic of Venice, which recognized the island's immense strategic and commercial value. For the Venetians, Crete, renamed Candia after its capital, modern Heraklion, became the linchpin of their maritime empire in the eastern Mediterranean. Over the next 4.5 centuries, Venetian Crete developed into a thriving province of trade, culture, and cross-cultural exchange, yet also a land of tension, marked by resistance, religious division, and occasional revolt. The Venetians approached Crete not as conquerors of a barbarian land, but as administrators of a valuable asset. They implemented a systematic policy of colonization and governance, dividing the island into 6 provinces, or sestiere, modeled on the divisions of Venice itself. The capital, Candia, was fortified and developed into one of the strongest citadels in the Mediterranean. Venetian nobles were granted large estates, and a new feudal order was imposed, displacing many local landowners. The native Cretan population, predominantly Greek and Orthodox Christian, was subjected to Latin ecclesiastical authority, as the Catholic Church became the official faith of the colony. Yet the Venetians also relied on the cooperation of local elites to maintain stability, creating a complex social hierarchy in which Latins dominated politically, but Greeks retained influence through land, commerce, and local administration. Economic integration was one of the hallmarks of Venetian rule. Crete's fertile soil and established agricultural traditions made it a vital supplier of wheat, olive oil, wine, and sugar for Venetian markets. The Republic's merchants controlled exports and monopolized trade routes, ensuring that profits flowed toward Venice. In return, Cretan ports benefited from the stability and commercial networks of the Venetian Empire. Candia, Rethymno, and Chania grew into bustling urban centers with mixed Latin and Greek populations. Venetian architecture, with its arcades, loggias, and fortifications, reshaped the island's towns, blending Western and Byzantine styles into a distinctive hybrid aesthetic. Stone palaces, Gothic churches, and aqueducts stood alongside Byzantine churches and monasteries, creating an architectural dialogue that mirrored the cultural synthesis of the age. Culturally, the Venetian centuries were transformative. Although Latin was the language of administration and law, Greek remained dominant among the local population. Over time, a bilingual culture emerged, especially in literature and the arts. The coexistence of Orthodox and Catholic traditions, though often marked by tension, produced an environment of creative synthesis. Cretan icon painting flourished during the 15th and 16th centuries, evolving into a distinct school that combined Byzantine spirituality with Renaissance naturalism. Artists such as Angelos Akatantos and Michael Damaskinos bridged the worlds of East and West, painting icons for both Orthodox monasteries and Catholic churches. The Cretan school would later give rise to one of the most famous painters in European history, Dominikos Theotokopoulos, better known as El Greco, who began his career in Candia before moving to Italy and Spain. Literary expression also thrived under Venetian rule. The Greek-speaking population, despite restrictions, maintained a vibrant intellectual life. The island became a center of printing and scholarship, and by the 16th century, a new form of Cretan vernacular literature had emerged. The pinnacle of this movement was the epic poem Erotokritos, composed by Vitsentzos Kornaros in the early 17th century. Written in the Cretan dialect, it fused medieval chivalric themes with Greek folk traditions, symbolizing the fusion of Venetian and Greek cultures. This flowering of art and literature under foreign domination illustrates the island's capacity to adapt and create even within structures of inequality. Yet Venetian rule was not without resistance. The imposition of feudalism and Catholic dominance provoked recurrent uprisings, especially during the 13th and 14th centuries. The first major revolt, the Revolt of St. Titus in 1363, began in Candia when both Greek and Latin settlers rebelled against heavy taxation and Venetian control. Although the uprising briefly established an autonomous commune, Venice swiftly crushed it, reaffirming its authority through a combination of military force and political concessions. Subsequent revolts, often led by local nobles or monasteries, reflected deep-rooted grievances over land distribution, taxation, and religious discrimination. However, over time, Venetian control became more stable, supported by local collaboration and shared economic interests. Religion remained a complex issue throughout Venetian rule. The Catholic hierarchy dominated official positions, but the Orthodox Church persisted as the spiritual home of the majority. Venice, recognizing the futility of outright suppression, gradually adopted a policy of limited tolerance. Orthodox bishops were permitted to function unofficially, and monastic communities continued to flourish in the countryside. Monasteries such as Arcadi and Toplu became not only centers of faith, but also guardians of Greek language and identity. The dual religious system, Latin in the cities, Orthodox in the villages, became a defining feature of Cretan society, reflecting the island's enduring duality between East and West. The 16th century marked the zenith of Venetian Crete. The island's economy prospered through the export of agricultural goods and the import of luxury items from Venice and the Levant. The population grew, urban centers expanded, and cultural production reached its peak. Venetian fortifications were strengthened to protect against the rising threat of the Ottoman Empire, whose expansion across the eastern Mediterranean posed an ever-growing danger. Massive walls and bastions were constructed around Candia, Chania, and Rethymno, many of which still stand today as testaments to the engineering skill of the Venetian military architects. These defenses, among the strongest in Europe, would soon be tested in one of the longest sieges in recorded history. By the early 17th century, the geopolitical balance of the Mediterranean had shifted dramatically. The Ottoman Empire dominated the Balkans, Asia Minor, and much of the Middle East, while Venice's maritime empire was in slow decline. Crete, as the jewel of the Venetian possessions, became both a target and a symbol of Venetian resilience. In 1645, Ottoman forces invaded the island, launching a campaign that would last more than 2 decades. The Cretan War, known as the War of Candia, culminated in the Siege of Candia, 1648 to 1669, one of the longest and most grueling sieges in world history. For 21 years, Venetian and Cretan defenders resisted relentless Ottoman assaults. The siege devastated the island, causing widespread famine and depopulation. Despite heroic resistance and occasional reinforcements from Europe, Venice eventually capitulated in 1669, surrendering Candia while retaining a few smaller fortresses. The fall of Candia ended over 4 centuries of Venetian rule and marked the beginning of Ottoman domination. Yet, even in defeat, Venice left an enduring imprint on Crete's landscape and culture. The fortresses, harbors, and public buildings it constructed became part of the island's architectural heritage. The blending of Latin and Greek traditions in art, language, and law persisted long after political control changed hands. Venetian Crete had been a world of contradictions, feudal yet commercial, repressive yet creative, Western yet profoundly Greek. Its legacy would continue to shape the island's identity under the Ottomans and beyond, as Crete once again adapted to the demands of a new empire while preserving the memory of its long and multifaceted past. The Ottoman conquest would transform Crete once more, socially, religiously, and demographically. As Islamic institutions joined the layers of Byzantine and Venetian heritage already embedded in the island's fabric. The next phase of Crete's story would unfold under the crescent banner of the Ottoman Empire, revealing new forms of endurance, coexistence, and struggle in the centuries to come. The Ottoman conquest of Crete in 1669 marked the end of Venetian dominance and the beginning of another era in the island's long history of foreign rule. The fall of Candia, after a siege that lasted more than 2 decades, symbolized not only the decline of Venetian power in the eastern Mediterranean, but also the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into one of the last remaining Venetian outposts. For Crete, this transition brought profound social, cultural, and religious transformation. Yet, despite the new order imposed by Istanbul, the island retained many elements of its Greek identity, adapting once again to a shifting imperial framework that would last for more than 200 years. The Ottomans approached Crete as a valuable strategic possession within their maritime network. It became a province, or eyalet, administered by a governor known as the Pasha, based in Candia, now renamed Candae in Turkish. The Ottomans reorganized the island's administration, dividing it into smaller districts under local officials. These reforms aimed to secure taxation, maintain military order, and integrate the island into the broader Ottoman administrative system. Land was redistributed according to the Timar system, in which soldiers and officials were granted estates in return for military service. The new landholding structure replaced Venetian feudalism with a centralized imperial model, though, in practice, much of the old hierarchy persisted under different names. Religious transformation accompanied political change. The Ottomans introduced Islam as the dominant faith, establishing mosques, medreses, Islamic schools, and baths throughout the cities. Many churches were converted into mosques, while new ones were constructed to serve the growing Muslim population, which included both settlers from Anatolia and local converts. Conversion was often motivated by social or economic incentives rather than forced coercion. Muslims enjoyed tax privileges and opportunities in administration, while Christians remained subject to the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims. Over time, a sizable portion of the Cretan population adopted Islam, creating a new class of Muslim Cretans who would play an important role in local society. Nevertheless, the Greek Orthodox Church continued to function under Ottoman tolerance, with the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople representing Orthodox interests before the Sultan. The Ottoman system in Crete was characterized by a delicate balance between control and local autonomy. The empire's primary concern was order and tax collection rather than cultural assimilation. Local communities were organized into millets, semi-autonomous religious communities that managed their own schools, marriages, and charitable institutions. This arrangement allowed Greek, Muslim, and Jewish communities to coexist, each governed by its own religious authority. Greek remained widely spoken, and Orthodox monasteries continued to preserve language and education. Despite differences of faith, many villages were mixed, and social relations were often pragmatic. Shared economic interests, local alliances, and trade created overlapping networks that softened the boundaries between communities, even as official hierarchies maintained division. Economically, Crete's position remained important. The island's agricultural potential continued to supply the Ottoman Empire with grain, olive oil, and wine, though large estates were now controlled by Muslim landlords. Trade flourished through the ports of Candae, Chania, and Rethymno, which linked the island to markets in Istanbul, Egypt, and North Africa. The Ottomans also used Crete as a naval base to project power across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. Yet the economic vitality of the island fluctuated with the fortunes of the empire itself. Periods of prosperity alternated with decline caused by war, piracy, and natural disasters. By the 18th century, the weakening of Ottoman central control allowed local notables, both Muslim and Christian, to gain greater influence, often at the expense of imperial authority. Life under Ottoman rule was marked by coexistence, but also by periodic unrest. The Greek Orthodox population never ceased to view themselves as distinct from the ruling power. Uprisings erupted repeatedly, often inspired by hopes of liberation or encouraged by external powers. The first major revolts occurred in the late 18th century, during the era of the Russo-Turkish Wars, when Russian agents promised support for Greek independence movements. These revolts were brutally suppressed, but they revealed the growing sense of Greek nationalism that was beginning to spread through the Orthodox world. The monasteries, especially those such as Arkady and Prevoli, became centers of resistance, safeguarding not only religion but also education and national identity. The 19th century brought accelerating change. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1829, ignited hopes across the Aegean, and Cretan rebels joined the struggle despite the island's distance from the Greek mainland. The revolt was widespread and fierce, but the Ottomans, with Egyptian assistance under Muhammad Ali's rule, crushed it after years of fighting. In gratitude for his support, the Sultan temporarily granted Crete to Egypt in 1830. Under Egyptian administration, the island saw limited reforms, including efforts at modernization, improved agricultural systems, and new schools, but resentment remained high among the Greek Christian majority. When Crete was returned to direct Ottoman control in 1840, the island was restless and divided, setting the stage for further uprisings. The Cretan Revolt of 1866 to 1869 became one of the most defining episodes of Ottoman rule. Sparked by heavy taxation, religious inequality, and nationalist aspirations, the rebellion spread across the island. The most famous event occurred at the Arkadi Monastery, where hundreds of rebels and civilians resisted an Ottoman siege. When defeat became inevitable, the defenders ignited their gunpowder stores, choosing death over surrender. This tragic act, though often romanticized later, had a profound political impact. It drew international sympathy for the Cretan cause and placed the Cretan question at the center of European diplomacy. Western newspapers and governments began to pressure the Ottoman Empire for reform, linking Crete's fate to the broader issue of Greek independence and Christian rights within Ottoman territories. In response to repeated revolts, the Ottoman government introduced reforms to placate both communities. The Organic Law of 1868 granted limited autonomy, establishing a local assembly with representation for Christians and Muslims. However, true equality remained elusive. Tensions persisted between the Muslim minority, concentrated in urban centers, and the Christian majority, dominant in rural areas. As the 19th century advanced, these tensions intensified, driven by both local grievances and the larger wave of nationalism sweeping southeastern Europe. By the late 19th century, the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of European influence made Crete a focal point of international rivalry. Britain, France, Russia, and Italy all had interests in the eastern Mediterranean, and the instability of Crete provided a pretext for intervention. The great powers increasingly viewed the island's unrest as a potential spark for a wider regional conflict. In 1897, after yet another revolt and the intervention of Greek forces, the island became the scene of an international crisis. The Ottoman army defeated the Greek expedition, but under European pressure, the empire was forced to accept a new arrangement. In 1898, Crete was granted autonomous status under Ottoman suzerainty, with Prince George of Greece appointed as High Commissioner. This new era of semi-independence marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman influence. Though the Sultan remained the nominal overlord, Crete effectively governed itself, adopting a Greek-style administration and education system. Greek became the official language, and symbols of Ottoman rule gradually disappeared. Over the next decade, tensions continued between local factions, especially between Cretan Muslims and Christians, but the direction of history was clear. In 1908, taking advantage of political turmoil within the Ottoman Empire, the Cretan Assembly unilaterally declared union with Greece. Although the move was not immediately recognized by the international community, it became a fait accompli after the Balkan Wars. In 1913, following the Treaty of London, Crete was formally united with the Kingdom of Greece. The Ottoman period had lasted nearly 2.5 centuries. It transformed Crete's demography, architecture, and social structure, leaving behind mosques, fountains, and fortifications that still mark the island's towns. It introduced Islam to Crete's cultural landscape, fostered local resilience, and linked the island to the broader narrative of imperial governance in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, through all those centuries, the Cretan people preserved their Greek language, Orthodox faith, and sense of distinct identity. The Ottoman era, for all its complexity, prepared Crete for its eventual emergence into the modern Greek state, an outcome shaped by centuries of adaptation, endurance, and cultural layering that defined the island's long journey through empire and history. As Crete entered the 20th century united with Greece, the legacy of Ottoman rule remained visible in its architecture, place names, and mixed heritage. The island, once a crossroads of empires, now stood as part of a modern nation-state, its history a testament to the endurance of a people who had survived and transformed under every power that sought to possess them. The unification of Crete with Greece in 1913 marked the close of one historical epoch and the beginning of another. After centuries of conquest, administration, and cultural exchange under Minoan, Mycenaean, Byzantine, Venetian, and Ottoman powers, the island finally joined a modern nation-state. Yet integration was not a simple act of political union. It was a process of social adaptation, modernization, and the redefinition of identity. The early decades of the 20th century found Crete adjusting to the challenges of national governance, economic change, and the turbulence that soon swept through both Greece and the wider world. The Cretan question, long a focal point of European diplomacy, was officially resolved with the Treaty of London in 1913, which recognized Crete's annexation by Greece following the Balkan Wars. The Greek flag replaced the Ottoman crescent over the fortresses of Chania, Rethymno, and Heraklion, marking the symbolic and administrative completion of union. Eleftherios Venizelos, Crete's most prominent statesman and later one of modern Greece's defining political figures, played a central role in securing this outcome. His rise from a local lawyer in Chania to Prime Minister of Greece reflected the island's growing integration into national politics. Venizelos championed liberal reform, constitutional governance, and modernization, guiding Greece through territorial expansion and into the complex alliances of the early 20th century. For the people of Crete, the years following unification brought both optimism and upheaval. The abolition of Ottoman landholding structures allowed for redistribution, giving many small farmers new independence. Education expanded rapidly, with schools teaching in Greek and promoting national consciousness. Orthodox churches regained prominence as cultural and spiritual centers, reinforcing the link between Greek identity and religion. Yet social divisions persisted between rural and urban populations, and the island's economy remained fragile. Agriculture, especially olive oil, grapes, and citrus, remained the foundation of livelihood, but industrial development lagged behind mainland Greece. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, soon drew Greece into the orbit of European conflict. Although the early years saw political division between King Constantine I, who favored neutrality, and Venizelos, who supported the Allies, Cretans largely followed Venizelos's lead. Many volunteered for service in the Macedonian front, contributing to the eventual victory of the Entente powers. The war, however, strained the island's economy and infrastructure, while exposing the new Greek state to the costs of modernization and international involvement. The post-war period brought new challenges. The 1920s were dominated by the Asia Minor Campaign, 1919 to 1922, during which Greece sought to extend its territory into western Anatolia. The defeat of Greek forces by the Turkish national movement under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led to the catastrophic population exchange of 1923, mandated by the Treaty of Lausanne. Tens of thousands of Greek Orthodox refugees from Asia Minor were resettled across Greece, and many found new homes in Crete. In turn, the island's remaining Muslim population, descendants of Ottoman-era converts and settlers, were relocated to Turkey. This exchange fundamentally altered the island's demographic landscape. Villages that had been mixed for centuries became entirely Christian, and the physical traces of Muslim life gradually faded, though not erased. Mosques were repurposed, Arabic inscriptions weathered into anonymity, and Turkish place names were replaced by Greek ones. Yet beneath these changes lay a memory of coexistence and transformation that had defined Cretan life for centuries. During the interwar years, Crete's economy began to modernize slowly. New roads linked the major towns, small industries developed in food processing and textiles, and the port of Heraklion expanded its trade connections. Education and literacy rates improved, particularly among younger generations. Still, Poverty and isolation remained widespread in the mountainous interior. Many Cretans immigrated to mainland Greece or abroad, seeking better opportunities. Politically, the island continued to play an outsized role in Greek affairs through Venizelos's influence. His advocacy for democratic reform and alignment with Western powers shaped Greece's trajectory between the two world wars, even as political instability and economic crises undermined national unity. The Second World War brought devastation on a scale not seen since antiquity. In May 1941, the German military launched Operation Mercury, the airborne invasion of Crete, the first major assault conducted entirely by paratroopers. Despite limited resources and outdated equipment, British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek forces, alongside local Cretan civilians, mounted fierce resistance. The Battle of Crete lasted just over a week, but its impact was profound. Although the Germans ultimately occupied the island, they suffered such heavy losses that Hitler forbade further large-scale airborne operations. Under German occupation, 1941 to 1945, Crete endured severe hardship. Food shortages, executions, and reprisals became common, especially in rural areas that supported the resistance. Cretan partisans, aided by Allied agents, waged one of the most effective guerrilla campaigns in occupied Europe. Sabotage operations, such as the destruction of the Gorgopotamos Bridge and the abduction of General Heinrich Kripe in 1944, became legendary symbols of defiance. Villages such as Kandanos and Anogia paid a terrible price for their role in resistance, suffering massacres and destruction. Yet the spirit of independence, deeply rooted in Cretan history, persisted even through the darkest years of occupation. When the war ended in 1945, Crete lay devastated. Infrastructure was destroyed, agriculture disrupted, and communities traumatized. Reconstruction began slowly, aided by international relief and the determination of the island's inhabitants. The late 1940s saw Greece engulfed in civil war between government forces and communist partisans, though Crete largely escaped direct fighting. Nevertheless, the conflict deepened social divisions and delayed recovery. In the decades that followed, Crete transformed once again, this time through modernization and integration into a globalizing world. The 1950s and 1960s saw new infrastructure projects, the expansion of electricity and education, and the first stages of tourism development. Air travel brought increasing numbers of visitors to the island's beaches and archaeological sites, especially Knossos, which had become a symbol of Greece's ancient heritage. Archaeological research resumed, now with a focus on conservation and scientific accuracy. The Minoan past, once buried under centuries of conquest, became central to Crete's modern identity and economic revival. Agriculture remained vital, but tourism gradually overtook it as the main source of income. Hotels, ports, and airports multiplied, transforming coastal towns into international destinations. Yet the heart of the island, its villages, traditions, and dialects, preserved much of its distinct character. Music, dance, and storytelling continued to express a deep connection to the land and its layered history. Crete's reputation for hospitality and independence, shaped through millennia of resilience, became both a cultural hallmark and a symbol of continuity amid change. Politically, Crete's influence in Greek life endured. The memory of Venizelos continued to guide public discourse, and his birthplace in Chania became a national monument. The island played a crucial role in national elections, often aligning with liberal and reformist currents. During the military junta of 1967 to 1974, Cretan resistance again emerged, reflecting a long tradition of opposition to authoritarian rule. After the restoration of democracy, the island prospered within the broader framework of Greece's entry into the European community in 1981. By the late 20th century, Crete had evolved from a peripheral region into a vital part of Greece's economic and cultural landscape. Universities, research centers, and museums expanded, fostering both local scholarship and international collaboration. Archaeology, in particular, flourished. Excavations at Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros deepened understanding of the Minoan world, while conservation efforts aimed to balance heritage preservation with the pressures of mass tourism. Environmental awareness grew alongside urban development, reflecting a modern consciousness of sustainability rooted in ancient respect for the land. Today, Crete stands as a living record of human continuity. From the Neolithic villages that first cultivated the soil to the Minoan palaces that once dominated the Aegean, from the Byzantine fortresses to the Venetian harbors, Ottoman minarets, and modern Greek cities, each era has left its mark. The island's identity is not the product of a single civilization, but of the accumulated experiences of many. Its people, language, and traditions embody the synthesis of East and West, of ancient and modern. The 21st century has brought new challenges: tourism management, economic fluctuation, and climate change, yet also opportunities for renewal. Crete's universities and research institutions contribute to Mediterranean studies, archaeology, and environmental science, making the island not merely a relic of history, but a participant in the ongoing dialogue between past and present. Cultural festivals, digital archives, and heritage programs continue to connect global audiences to Crete's layered story. In reflecting upon Crete's modern journey, one finds the essence of continuity that links the Minoan frescoes to contemporary life, the persistence of adaptation, creativity, and independence. The same island that nurtured Europe's first civilization now serves as a crossroads of cultures once more, this time through ideas, education, and global exchange. The narrative that began thousands of years ago in the fertile valleys of Knossos has not ended. It has simply transformed, evolving alongside the people who have always called Crete home. Through the examination of its archaeological record, written sources, and living traditions, Crete's history reveals the long arc of civilization itself, how human societies rise, endure, and renew. The island's story is neither isolated nor static. It reflects the broader currents of Mediterranean history, from the invention of writing to the emergence of modern democracy. In understanding Crete, one glimpses the endurance of culture amid change, and the ways in which geography, resilience, and human imagination can sustain identity across millennia. As the documentary draws to a close, the camera would return to the timeless landscapes of Crete, the olive groves shimmering in the wind, the white mountains above ancient plains, and the ruins of Knossos standing silent yet eloquent. These images, grounded in the evidence of archaeology and the continuity of life, remind us that civilization is not a vanished past, but an ongoing conversation between history and humanity. Through archaeology and written record, their story continues to teach us how civilization began and how it endures.